Good morning, everyone. Tim has sounded the signal. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Planning and Housing Committee. This is a special meeting. Let's make some magic happen. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that we are on the unsurrendered and unceded land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Could I ask the clerk to do the roll call, please?
Councillor Luloff.
Present.
Councillor Dudas.
Present.
Councillor Curry.
Here.
Councillor Kavanaugh.
Here.
Councillor Johnson.
EC.
Councillor Tierney.
Present.
Councillor Troster.
Here.
Councillor Brockington.
Here.
Councillor Kitts.
Here.
Councillor Brown.
Here.
Councillor Lowe.
Here.
Vice Chair Gower.
Here.
Vice Chair Kelly.
Present.
Chair DeRuse.
Here.
Chair Leeper, you have quorum.
Thank you very much, everyone. So this is obviously a meeting to take a look at three separate reports. The one is on the Bill 109 response. There is the report on the delegated authority, and there is also the provincial resource impact report. We're going to try to deal with the whole package today. So I know staff have a comprehensive presentation to make. We're also going to allow the delegations to speak to all three of the items. I know one of the delegations has split their presentations into two to deal with two separate reports. So they'll be doing one after the other as part of the delegations. We're going to start out receiving that comprehensive report. I'm going to ask members, I know there are a number of motions that are going to be moving forward today. So after the staff presentation, I'm going to ask members who have motions or who would like to give staff direction just to put those on the table. Then we'll move into the questions of staff and debate before we vote one after the other on the motions that amend the final reports, and then we are out of here. So if that's good with everyone, I think what I'd like to do is start out and ask staff to make their presentation.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members of the Planning and Housing Committee and Agricultural Affairs, for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm joined by Emily Davies, who's our Manager of Special Projects, who's been leading our response to Bill 109. As I'm sure many of you can appreciate, it's been a busy year with changes in various housing bills coming from the province, and staff have worked diligently to try to adapt to those. And we do have a presentation that will deal with the three reports that are before you today: the Delegated Authority Report, the response to Bill 109, and a resource request that is also before you. Next slide, please. Some of the things that you'll see today and through the Delegation of Authority report, which is fairly standard. It's a standard report that we report regularly on. Bill 109, Emily will walk us through the phase 2 report with an overview, a current process, a comparison of the current process and the proposed new multi-tiered pre-consultation process, changes being proposed to the public consultation, and governance. And finally, we'll have the provincial resource impact report where we'll talk about a staffing request. Next slide. With respect to the numbers on the delegation of authority, the staff this year in planning have dealt with 13,000 right-of-way and public realm permits. There's been 95 heritage permits issued, 36 approved projects, 138 bylaws drafted, 19 community environmental projects grant, and on our inspection side, we've released securities related to $164 million worth of construction activity. Next slide, please. We've dealt with a number of pre-applications that have come in. As you can see, the trend is significantly less than 2021, but we're not far off in 2022 of the sort of running average in our normal course of business. But there is a trend that we are watching. Next slide. Development applications follow a similar trend. Obviously, there's a peak in 2021. There was also a peak in 2019 that you'll see that was related largely in response to getting ahead of a development charge update. But we are still trending on that sort of 2018 trend line. Next slide. And now I'll pass it over to Emily to walk us through some of the impacts with respect to Bill 109 and where we're going from here.
Thank you, Derek. So I'm here to speak to the Bill 109 component of the report before you. Just for sake of jogging everyone's memory, Bill 109 is a piece of legislation that was dropped by the province in April of last year. This piece of legislation had a number of major changes to the Planning Act. The portion of the legislation that we are imposing today or reacting to today is with regards to the refunds of fees. So the legislation has imposed a 60-day requirement for the processing of site plan control applications and a 90-day requirement for the processing of zoning bylaw amendment applications. Both of those application timelines in the current way the city processes them, we take on average 196 days to process a site plan control, so well over what the provincial allotment is mandating. And then 178 days to process a zoning bylaw amendment. Again, well over what the provincial legislation is going to be mandating. Come January or July 1st, sorry, the deadlines have continuously changed, but come July 1st, there will be refunds imposed if the municipalities across Ontario do not meet those timelines. The City of Ottawa is not the only one in this boat. The legislation is impacting all municipalities across Ontario, and we obviously did not ask for these changes, but we have to react and determine a path forward to change business processes in order to meet these mandated timelines. Next slide, please. This slide shows an overarching timeline of where we've gone to date since the legislation did pass last year. We did bring forward a report in July of last year reacting to a number of the pieces of the legislation, primarily surrounding site plan controls and the delegation of authority. So that was before committees and council last summer. Since then, we've been working over the course of the winter to determine a number of internal and process changes in order to lead us up to today with the report before you with a number of recommendations reacting to Bill 109 refunds of fees. Next slide, please. The existing process, I wanted to showcase this and let everybody know what we are working with today. What has been our business process for processing site plan controls and zoning bylaw amendments is typically an application will come in for pre-consultation. And Derek just showed the numbers that we've seen historically, which are a variety of about 1,000 per year. Once the application has concluded their one-stage pre-consultation, they then submit their application and it's deemed complete. After it's deemed complete, this is when the city typically goes through a number of revisions. The city and staff work with the applicant to address any issues with the application and go through a number of different submissions and revisions to that application. And all that leading up to bringing forward the report for consideration to committees and council for a decision. So we had to analyze this process, how it was working, how it had been working over the last decade, and find ways to improve it and to make sure that we can process applications faster in order to hit the deadlines allotted by the province so that we're not going to be taking a massive financial hit with the implication of refunds of fees. Next slide, please. This slide before you shows the proposed process, which is going to be implemented by the changes before you in the Bill 109 report. We are proposing that a multi-tiered pre-consultation process be put into place. This multi-tiered pre-consultation process will require site plan controls and zoning bylaw amendments, those two files only. So not all Planning Act applications. We are only targeting the two that are subject of the Bill 109 legislation. Those two files would have to go through multiple steps for pre-consultation in order to ensure that they're getting the necessary feedback from the city, from staff, from stakeholders, in order to revise their application before they submit it. Once they go through the proposed three-phase pre-consultation, the application would then be in a position to be submitted and deemed complete. Once it's deemed complete, it then enters into what we call official review, which is where we're counting every day that the province has allotted. So we're counting 60 days for site plan control and 90 days for zoning bylaw amendment. Next slide, please. The report before you has 9 recommendations. We've grouped those 9 recommendations really into 3 different buckets. The first bucket is with regards to internal process changes. So a number of things that we're looking to change in our typical business process in order to streamline applications internally. The second bucket is with regards to bylaw amendments. There are 5 bylaw amendments that we are proposing in order to align ourselves with setting up for a pre-consultation process, ensuring that we have proper fee structure for it, and so forth. The third bucket is with regards to directions for further action. So there are a few recommendations before you, and I will speak to them in a moment regarding directing staff to look into things and report back to committees and council. Next slide, please. Some of the key changes regarding the internal business process changes are with regards to adjusting the circulation timelines for site plan control. In today's current process, we allow for 28 days for circulation for site plan control, and having analyzed how we can utilize those 60 days that the province has assigned, we can no longer afford 28 of those 60 days to be dedicated to circulation. So we are proposing to reduce that circulation time to a 14-day window and continue to support constituents and stakeholders to submit comments on site plan controls within that 14-day window. The other internal process change that we are looking to institute is a very strict timeline for circulation comments. In the past, for site plan controls and zoning bylaw amendments, we've had a lot of leeway in allowing comments to trickle in well past the deadlines and still consider them for changes to the report or the proposal. Given that the province has instituted very strict timelines, we no longer can afford any leeway, and we're going to have very strict timelines for comments to be submitted. And that information will be relayed to proponents through the circulation material that's sent out. The other internal process changes with regards to resubmissions. We can no longer allow for resubmissions of site plan controls and zoning bylaw amendments, meaning that once an application has been filed, once they've gone through those pre-consultation processes, that is the proposal that will be decided upon through that process. The last change regarding internal process changes is with regards to concurrent applications. The legislation under the Planning Act does not allow or does not account for site plan controls and zoning bylaw amendments to be considered together. So we are going to have a rule that those 2 types of applications will be processed separately, a zoning bylaw amendment coming first and then a site plan control coming after. That said, those 2 applications can go through pre-consultation together, and we will encourage that of applicants so that a whole package will be considered by staff in order to provide comprehensive feedback. But once it enters into official review, we will have to process site plan controls after zoning bylaw amendments. The caveat to that rule is that the Planning Act does allow for official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments to come together. And in those instances, the Planning Act allows for 120 days for the municipality to process it. So they do specifically recognize those 2 types of applications can come forward concurrently. Next slide, please. I will pass this slide over to Derek to cover. Thank you.
One of the things that I think is important to be clear is that there is no one solution that we're looking at to bring us from 196 days down to 60 days for a site plan. It's a layering and a number of different initiatives and looking at basically our entire process. Emily's talked about the pre-application consultation process. We're looking at changing some of our conditions or looking at opportunities to condition things. But one of the things that we're looking at in the middle is a fundamental change to the way we assign our work. Currently today, a file comes in and is assigned to an individual planner and an individual project manager, which is typically a professional engineer or a civil engineering technologist, to review those files with respect to their own disciplines. And they're also responsible for the carriage of that file from essentially soup to nuts. And so if there's issues with respect to the signs, if there's collating comments from the public, that individual is the individual that is responsible and has carriage for that file. One of the things we're looking in and starting the implementation process of now is a team approach to files where we've got a group of the two types of disciplines assigned to each file, which we hope will give us an opportunity to improve efficiency, where we've got, you know, the right type of person doing the right type of work. So I don't have some of my most senior staff doing administrative tasks or following up on sign details. We hope it will give us a resiliency so that if a staff member needs to take leave for whatever reason, or attend Ontario Municipal Board hearings, or step away from a file, that there are others that are already engaged in that file that know what the next steps are and can continue to move it through the process. And you know, through those initiatives, we're really hoping that they'll also increase consistency by having more senior staff involved in more files, you know, not being bogged down with some of the administrative work, that they can really share their knowledge and information with some of our younger staff to mentor them through the process and essentially train them as we go. And through that process, provide that consistency that we sometimes lack on applications. And I'm sure many of you have heard from applicants about, you know, concerns related to consistency and why are they doing it this way? And this person did it a different way. And we're hoping that that's something that we can address through this team approach. It is really a fundamental difference to the way we work. It sounds easy, but our processes are very complex, and we've gone through a lot of work to determine, you know, what type of person should be doing what type of task. And that is something that we are really looking forward at implementation, and we think it will yield significant results. Next slide, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Derek. I'm just now going to speak to a couple of the other recommendations before you as part of the Bill 109 report. One of the recommendations is with regards to direction to staff to look into a tool that is in the Planning Act regarding zoning bylaw amendments. Through analyzing the process, we've understood that our timeline for 90 days to process a zoning bylaw amendment is really tight, especially with having to rise to committees and council and have the bylaw passed within that 90-day timeline. So one of the tools in the Planning Act is to delegate minor zoning bylaw amendments to staff. There is no decision before you regarding this today. What is before you is direction to staff to look into this tool and determine options to consider at a later time that we can bring back to committee and council for consideration. Next slide, please. The other recommendation before you is with regards to the development application study policy bylaw. It's a total mouthful. It is a bylaw that we need to amend in order to adjust the studies that are listed on it. This bylaw is really important in the wake of approving the new official plan. The new official plan no longer contains a list of studies that could be requested as part of a complete application. What the new official plan does is it gives a nod to this bylaw, and this bylaw is the home where all of the studies that could be requested as part of a complete application are listed. So this bylaw needs to be updated on a continual basis in order to ensure that it lists the proper studies that we would want to ask for as part of a site plan control or zoning bylaw amendment. If the studies are not listed on here, we do not have the legal ability to ask for them. So that is why this is really critical. So we have analyzed this bylaw and taken feedback from external stakeholders as well as internally. And before you are adjusting or suggesting a number of different changes to the bylaw in order to remove some studies, add some new studies. And when I say studies, I also mean information and material. Some of them are just forms. And change the titles of some of those information and material pieces. Next slide, please. There are also a number of public engagement changes that we are looking to adjust in order to react to the provincial changes. Regarding zoning bylaw amendments, we will begin to strongly encourage and recommend that consultation on applications be taken place during pre-consultation. So we're going to be asking applicants to go out and talk to their communities, talk to counselors, talk to their constituents in order to propose their recommendations or their development into the community. We are also going to be proposing public meetings as part of the Planning Act. Those will remain at Planning and Housing Committee as well as Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee. That is the legal place for those. Regarding site plan controls, there will no longer be an opportunity for city-led consultation meetings. To clarify that, consultation meetings can still continue at the discretion of councillors, as well as at the discretion of the industry, as well as at the discretion of the applicant. It's just the city will no longer have the time to initiate those consultation sessions during that 60-day window. DevApps will still remain also a critical touch point for everyone, where the information on files will be available on DevApps, and comments can be taken through DevApps for site plan controls as well as zoning bylaw amendments. Next slide, please. Governance changes. I believe this is recommendation 6 in the report. There are a slew of governance changes that we are proposing in order to recognize that zoning bylaw amendment files have to come through committees and council, as well as the bylaw be passed. Previously or currently today, a zoning bylaw amendment can take anywhere up to about 46 days to go through that process. And when we are counting 90 days, 46 days is almost half, and we can't allot for that timeline anymore. So we need to make some changes. And so the changes that are before you for consideration are with regards to allowing special meetings occur for Planning and Housing Committee during otherwise legislative breaks, where there are zoning bylaw amendments on the docket. It is only zoning bylaw amendments that are time sensitive. And so those are the ones that we are proposing need to be considered at special meetings of Planning and Housing Committee for those files to rise to council for approval or refusal. Regarding zoning bylaw amendments, again, we are proposing that the bylaw be adopted at the same day that the report is before council. The bylaw being adopted is the end of the process. So that is the end of the 90 days. So it is really critical that that bylaw also rise to council as quickly as possible. Zoning bylaw amendment reports, we're also suggesting that the reports be published 6 days before committee. The current standard right now is 10 days, but those savings of 4 days really help the planning department's timelines in order to meet that 90-day requirement. So the proposal is to go from 10 days to 6 days in publishing zoning bylaw amendment reports. The last change that is before you is with regards to rural zoning matters being able to rise to Planning and Housing Committee, where the rural zoning matter cannot meet the timeline typically to go to ARAC, which meets once a month. So that is an option for rural zoning matters to hit the timelines allotted by the province. Next slide, please. I will pass it back to Derek to speak to report number 3 on the resourcing impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I guess the report that's before you recommends changes to the resources that recognize and take into account the additional workload and increase in service level as a result of the provincial bills. The objective is to positively impact timelines. And I guess the meat of this report is that the staff are recommending the addition of a total of 37 additional FTEs to support planning applications, along with 2 permanent positions being created, 2 permanent positions being created. Next slide, please. So the financial impact of those 37, we are proposing that 32 of them will be funded through planning application fees. So they would not be a direct impact to the tax rate. The 5 positions that are identified that are within heritage or other downloaded services are proposed to be funded through the tax. So there would be an impact to tax of $640,000 and a $4.4 million increase that we're looking to generate through increased planning application fees. I think it's worth talking a little bit about how our budget is derived. There's been some information shared recently that provides some of the information, but maybe not the whole picture. So within planning services, we go to two committees for budget approval. We go to Planning and Housing Committee, and we go to Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. And the staff that are working on and dedicated to rural files are segregated, and that those staff are approved ultimately through Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, and the table that's before you here shows that breakdown. The revenues that we generate, though, are all recognized in the Planning and Housing Committee budget. The rationale for that is that as applications come in through the Client Service Center, and traditionally it has been very difficult to determine at that level whether it's a rural file or an urban file, because we do have a number of split wards and boundaries continue to change through various planning processes. Next slide, please. So we have a bit of a breakdown of our fees that show the various types of fees and where they come from. The point I'd like to highlight here is, we generate fees. There are application fees that we generate, which are, an official plan amendment application, a zoning application, site plan, and so forth. We also have a bucket of fees, which are engineering, design review, and inspection fees. And they're based on the cost of works and they're charged at the time of approval. And so today that's 4.5% of hard surfacing and 2.25% of soft servicing. And hard servicing is things like sanitary sewers, water mains, roads. Soft servicing is landscaping, trees, and things of that nature. And so the green pie piece that's segregated essentially shows that. And those revenues are a considerable amount of our budget. And we're also, and next slide, please. I think it's on the next slide. So we are proposing to increase those fees in addition to our planning application fees from 4.5% of cost of works to 5% for hard servicing, from 2.25% to 2.5%. Next slide, please. I should note, while we're increasing that amount, those design review and inspection fees do not all rest within planning services. Currently, 40% of those go to the inspection side of things, which is managed through our right-of-way, heritage, and urban design group. And so while we're increasing the amount, we are adjusting the split so that the increase will rest with planning services. The budget allocation towards right-of-way and in the inspection group will remain the same as it is today. So that split will change slightly from, it was on the page, I think it's 64 to 36 as opposed to 60-40. Is there a next slide? That's it. Great. So we're happy to answer any questions if you have any. I'm sure you can appreciate it, it's been a busy year, and I thank Emily and the rest of staff that have contributed to the process and mapped things out. It really has been a bit of an exercise, and I'm looking forward to the discussion as we proceed today.
Thank you very much to all of our staff. Obviously, 109 has created a need right across Ontario for municipalities to try to deal with a really significantly impactful piece of legislation. I don't think any of us want to be in this position today, although there are some really interesting components of the proposals in front of us with respect to retooling how the department works that are actually kind of exciting and worth doing regardless of whether 109 is in place or not. As I noted, I want to get the motions on the table related to all of the items now. Could I ask that if you have a motion related to 3.1, which is the Bill 109 implementation, could you just raise your hands or catch my eye and let me know that you have one of those? Councillor Johnson. Yeah, could you put your motion on the table, please?
Thank you. I thought I was just raising my hand. Okay. So to put it on the table, I will read it. It's on the screen. Thank you very much. So whereas the City of Ottawa is committed to public participation in the planning and development process, and whereas the city initiated in 2014 a development application pre-application consultation program with community associations with the objective to increase transparency to the city's development review process and to allow for early input by the community into the development proposal. And whereas any public participant from the 6 participating wards must attend training and sign a non-disclosure agreement acknowledging their understanding of a confidentiality requirement under the Planning Act. And whereas the province's Bill 109 introduced tight timelines for development applications to be considered during official review. And whereas Bill 109 implementation phase 2 report introduces a multi-phased pre-consultation process for development applications, which introduces 3 phases to allow the applicant to discuss their idea, to obtain preliminary feedback, present their refined idea and any draft studies for comment, and finally submit their final proposal for the study review to ensure the studies are complete, consistent with one another, and contain enough information to allow a proper application processing during the provincially timed review. And whereas there is opportunity to build upon the existing pre-consultation engagement with community associations in the context of Bill 109's multi-phase pre-consultation process. Therefore, be it resolved that staff be directed to undertake a fulsome review of the pre-application consultation program that involves community associations to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of the current process, examine potential expansion of the pre-application consultation program with community associations, and undertake an education, training, and awareness initiative in relation to the program, and that the result of this review be reported back to council within 18 months at the latest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Dudas?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Whereas this report recommends amendments to the pre-consultation bylaw 2009-320 to introduce multi-tiered pre-consultation processes. Whereas pre-consultation is a process that takes place between applicants and city staff, with other participants signing non-disclosure agreements given the commercial confidentiality of development projects in early stages. Whereas members of council may have an interest in participating in the pre-consultation process early on for development application files. And whereas site plan control approval authority rests with staff by appointment, not delegation, which limits the role of elected officials. Whereas approval authority on zoning bylaw amendments remains with council, which may permit involvement of elected officials on the pre-consultation process. Therefore, be resolved that staff be directed to assess the feasibility of councillor participation in pre-consultation for zoning bylaw amendment applications and report back to council in Q4 2023 with their findings.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dudas. Councillor Gower?
Thank you, Chair. This is on development of a dispute resolution process. So whereas the Bill 109 implementation phase 2 report introduces a multi-phase pre-consultation process for development applications, which introduces 3 phases to allow the applicant to discuss their idea, to obtain preliminary feedback, present their refined idea, and any draft studies for comment, and finally submit their final proposal for the study review to ensure the studies are complete, consistent with one another, and contain enough information to allow a proper application processing during the provincially timed review. And whereas a dispute resolution process for issues that may arise during the pre-consultation process was not identified in the report, and whereas it is in the interests of applicants and the city to ensure that development application files move smoothly through the new pre-consultation process in a timely manner, with the shared objective to facilitate the building of homes to solve the housing crisis, therefore be it resolved that planning services staff will be directed to develop a dispute resolution procedure for the pre-consultation process and report back to council via memo by the end of Q3 2023 on the process and implementation timeline, and report on the use of the dispute resolution process be included as part of the monitoring report as per recommendation 9.
Thank you very much. And Chair Drews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is after my consultation with my Agricultural Affairs Committee members, whereas ERAC was created to ensure that matters pertaining to rural Ottawa, including planning matters, are considered from rural perspective with full appreciation of rural issues and impact. And whereas Bill 109 will impose stricter timelines related to zoning bylaw amendment and site plan control application, and whereas Bill 109 implementation phase 2 outlines staff requests for amendments to council and committees governance processes, terms of references, and their procedure bylaw in order to adhere to provincial timelines. And whereas item 3.1 recommendation 8A asks the Joint Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, ERAC, and Planning and Housing Committee, PHC, to schedule to schedule council and PHS bi-weekly on alternating Wednesdays in order to meet provincial timelines. And whereas recommendation 8D asks the joint committee to enable all zoning matters in the city to have the ability to be considered at the PHC, allowing rural zoning file to be considered there if there are time pressures related to rural files that are unable to be considered at the regularly scheduled ERAC meeting. And whereas it is integral that council aims to refer the appropriate items to their respective committees whenever possible to ensure that they are considered in their appropriate jurisdiction, whereas ERAC is proportionally small committee in comparison to another committee, and there is a requirement of 3 members to have a quorum, meaning it will ordinarily not be difficult to have a quorum during the time-sensitive circumstances. Therefore, be it resolved that for items that are related to rural zoning matters, staff be directed to prioritize consideration at a special meeting of ERAC prior to considering routing to PHC, and be further resolved that recommendation 8DB amend to read as follow: enable all zoning matters in any area of the city to have the ability to be considered at Planning and Housing Committee, allowing a rural zoning file to go to Planning and Housing Committee instead of Agriculture Committee Affairs, should there be a time pressure to meet the provincially imposed deadline, provided that the Agricultural Rural Affairs Committees is given opportunity to hold special meeting and is able to meet quorum to consider the matter. Be further resolved that requires special meetings be regularly scheduled on the day Planning and Housing Committee is otherwise scheduled. It's a long one, but you got the gist of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. So those are the 4 motions that relate to item 3.1. Relate to item 3.2, there are a motion, and I'm going to ask Councillor Gower to give us a preview of the direction that he will be asking staff to take as well.
Okay, I'll do the motion first. This is on legal services staffing. Whereas legal services completes a key step in the processing of development applications, including but not limited to reviewing decision report recommendations, reviewing zoning plans, reviewing site plan control conditions, writing the development agreements, and preparing for and attending Ontario Land Tribunal hearings. And whereas ensuring that all parts of the development approval process are appropriately supported to enable the building of homes faster as per the city's housing pledge and in accordance with provincial timelines. Therefore, be it resolved that legal services undertake a review of their staff complement required to deliver on their responsibilities regarding planning applications, and should additional resources be identified as required, that the pressures be put forward during the 2024 budget process and the legal portion of planning services fee be adjusted accordingly. And I have a direction around a planning services reserve, and the direction is that staff be directed to explore the feasibility of a planning services reserve and report back to council as part of the disposition of 2023 tax and rate supported operating surplus and deficit.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. The that latter direction, my intent is to ask staff to take that direction after we've heard from the delegations and had an opportunity to debate the whole item. So we have 4 delegations before we move into councillors' questions. The first is actually from Jason Burgraff at GOBA. He's joined today for a presentation on 3.1 by Philip Oosterhout. And then he's joined again for item 3.2 by Peter Norman with Altus Group. My suggestion is that we hear those 2 presentations one after the other. So Jason, number 1.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair and everyone for the Joint Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. As the Chair said, I'm pleased to be joined by Philip Oosterhout of Soloway Wright, who can answer some of the legal questions as it pertains to the pre-consultation bylaw, and by Peter Norman of Altus Group to speak to the analysis on the fee proposal or the user fee increase proposal that is in front of you as well. So first and foremost, on the pre-consultation process, there's already been a motion to look at a dispute mechanism. That was an issue that upon seeing the finalized version of the pre-consultation bylaw, that was kind of the first thing that jumped out on us. In our written submission, we've outlined amendments with a few proposed clauses to ensure that there's accountability to keep those applications moving within the identified timelines. And the provisions, the dispute provisions that we've offered only kind of confirm what the current statutory recourse is. We're not looking for anything new. We're just acknowledging that the process that should be in place and that we're not going to throw out everything in every case when there's a dispute over one item. And generally, we feel that provisions clarify the process both to the city's benefit as much as it does to industry. The second item is on concurrent applications. Right now, as Emily pointed out in her presentation, there's a loss of the ability to submit a concurrent application for site plan and for zoning. And really, having each file to be a separate application will add significant and unnecessary costs and delays to the development applications approvals process. I think staff and GOBA and members agree on all that. New housing proposals really need to be permitted to proceed concurrently to reduce staff workload and to promote a more efficient development process. So we're urging the city to reach out to the Minister of Housing and request that they enable the ability to have a concurrent application for zoning and site plan, let it be processed within 150 days. We're certainly happy to support that effort in any way we can. The final comment I'm going to make on this first section is on the development application study policy bylaw. And again, it's kind of been somewhat buried compared to all these other items that are under consideration today, but it proposes a list of studies that can be required as part of a complete application. But right now, the terms of references for 30 out of the 42 studies that are in the updated bylaw have been revised by staff and are currently under review by industry. So it's really an impossible task for GOBA or its members to endorse a list of studies, yay or nay, when their individual contents have yet to be finalized. So requiring, overall, the general principle should be requiring unnecessary studies will delay applications from being deemed complete, and reducing the number of studies would certainly reduce red tape and reduce staff workload, which would result in quicker and less expensive development approvals. And reducing the amount of studies will also have a direct impact on land carrying costs. So, we want to get through our process of reviewing the individual pieces. What we're asking is, once the terms of references of all these studies have been finalized, let's bring the development application study policy back for consideration in case there are possible changes to it, including, we want to see a comparison of studies in other jurisdictions on what the lists are required there, what the contents within each of those are, and possible scoping of required studies for OPAs, for zoning, for site plan, as other jurisdictions do as well. Given that, maybe I'll stop on this first portion, and I see that there's a question, and I'll ask maybe the chair, do you want us to respond to questions now or keep going to the second part?
Could you roll into your second presentation, and Councillor, did you want to ask that now, Councillor Lula? Well, it's fresh. Yep. You know what? Councillor Lula will pose that now.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It is relatively quick. It's my understanding that this list of studies are studies that could be possibly be asked of an applicant, and that not all of them will be asked of an applicant on every single application. Can you give me an idea of like what the average amount of studies are asked for in something like a site plan review, something like an OPA amendment, and perhaps like a plan of subdivision, just to give me kind of an idea. I don't often sit at planning committee. We deal with rural files only, and at ARAC, so that would be quite helpful if you don't mind.
Sure. You know what? I don't want to speak on a subject that I can't speak authoritatively to. What I would ask, though, is I believe Murray Chown is one of the speakers who's behind me, and he would be the perfect person to ask that particular question to. Sorry, I wish I could answer.
No, thank you very much.
Thanks. See no other questions for that. Councillor Curry.
Just for clarification, so one of the asks here is that some of these studies that are being requested, we just drop them all together instead of moving them earlier in the process, that you prefer that we just get rid of some of them because they don't seem to be important. But I'm just wondering if you have a list of some of the ones that you would say really could just be dropped altogether.
I think the most might be the most controversial one, but also the one is the mature neighborhoods overlay. That is frankly, that is the one that is going to impede the city the most in terms of achieving its intensification goals. I can't speak to every single instance under the survey and all the technicalities under it, but it is the biggest barrier for intensification, especially obviously on areas where its application is. And then if you want to achieve your intensification goals, especially on an affordable sense of things, that mature neighborhoods overlay is one that I know members have discussed as being a significant impediment.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll definitely ask questions about that.
If I could follow up on Councillor Curry's question, sorry, the mature neighborhoods overlay, are you referring to the streetscape character analysis?
I'm sorry. Yes, that's
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And I'm happy to permit questions on this segment following the next presentation. But Jason, do you want to speak to item 3.2?
Sure. Well, so now we get into the fun one, right? Well, I mean, as you can imagine, to increase planning fees 17.5% has caused a lot of consternation for the industry. But it's really not for the sake of the increase itself. GOBA and its members have always supported the planning department having the staffing and the resources it needs to deliver its services. It's that we've agreed to increase, we've agreed to increase fees in the past with a promise of more hiring that never materialized. We've agreed to increase fees in the past with a promise of better and faster approvals processes that we also haven't seen. It's for the fact that, as outlined in our submission and in the analysis by Altus Group, that the planning department has seen a surplus of $10.6 million over the past 5 years, money that should have been invested years ago for the people in the department that it's saying it's now going to hire. It's for the fact that despite the city's own budget documents forecasting a budget surplus of $1.26 million this year, that there's a fee increase on the table for $1.1 million for the fourth quarter of 2023 to pay for this new staff. If there's already enough money to pay for staff expenditures in this fiscal year, why are we asking for a fee increase now, especially after we just completed an entire city budget process 2 months ago? I mean, let's be honest, it's going to take a miracle to hire 32 new people and have them in place by October 1st of this year. The likelihood of seeing a 1.1 million more in expenses by the end of the year is minimal. It's wholly inappropriate for planning fees to increase now and have a surplus that goes into the general tax stabilization fund at the end of the year. I mean, that really brings me to the second request, and I know that Councillor Gower's motion speaks to this, and that its planning committee have its own specific reserve fund, which would not only ensure planning fees are spent for the purpose that they were collected for, but it would also provide the department with a buffer to continue its level of service and staffing in an economic downturn. Since I have a few extra minutes, I'm going to speak to 2 questions that I got from staff yesterday about the analysis, because I won't get a chance to ask them questions. Only you guys get to do that. But it's the first was, does it include the expenditures related to development review rural and items under ARAC? And Peter can certainly also confirm that, in fact, the analysis does include that. So that part is covered as well. Staff brought up to me the idea of having they have not completed a comprehensive review of costs, including overhead for planning services. That's not been completed. And I appreciate that point. The issue I particularly have with it is that I've also heard that question for 5 years. It was brought up and the last fee increased. It gets brought up when I've referenced tax stabilization, the surplus shift to tax stabilization fund at Fedco in years past as well. If that report was so important and that cost analysis was so critical to the planning department's provision of services, I really feel it would have been done by now. And frankly, the fact that it hasn't really tells me that either it's not as critical or the situation as it currently stands is more beneficial overall for the city than looking at those costs. So I really have to, leave it to dismiss that concern. I mean, the other point that was brought up somewhere along the line is that, the fact is, Bill 109 didn't all of a sudden bring on this sudden need for new staff. The department has long recognized that it needs more staff, more resourcing. We've recognized it. We're happy to support it. As I said, we've supported fee increases in the past. this is, the fee increase that's being proposed is on the table today is not just a reaction to new demands from Bill 109. It's a reaction to the lack of investment in the planning services over the past 5 years, and frankly before that. Certainly, I've been talking about this, the entire time that I've been in this position. So I'm going to leave it at that. As you can imagine, a fee increase of this size is very frustrating for industry who are trying to look at more housing, housing affordability, trying to get through the process faster and more efficiently. Have looked at a lot of money that the planning department has seen in surpluses over the years that were then not retained for the reasons that they were collected for. So we urge you to reject a fee increase on this today, and let's review it next year when proper analysis and is done. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGrath. Councillor Curry.
Thank you. So my question is to Jason. Are you hearing across the province at all any different stories from other municipalities with how they're managing the costs? Because when the provincial government came out and said they would make us whole, I don't know what detail there was around what that meant. I mean, we've heard them say that before, but if they're asking us to build faster, build more homes, whatever they're asking us to do, and then saying, but the cost for that would have to go to the builders, that doesn't seem to me something that this provincial government would want to have as a message. Because I thought I understood that if we're going to have to put more staff in place and have faster processes, that the government would help us do that with funding for it, not that we then turn around and increase our fees. But I'm wondering what Jason's hearing from other of his colleagues around the province.
I understand that other municipalities are certainly are going to propose similar changes to the processes that the City of Ottawa does. Or is putting on the table today. We don't have an issue with most of the processes. There's concern about the pre-consultation process and whether it'll actually mean a longer timeline for sure. But I think with good oversight and good reporting and feedback on our part, I think we can make that process work. The provincial promises in terms of money is really about the development charges. And reducing those on rentals and other affordable housing units, and not really related to the processing part overall. So there is that's really two separate streams there.
Okay, thanks. I have more questions for staff as well.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for your presentation and for raising some of the concerns here. Although I disagree with some of your characterizations about planning department and resources, I think a lot of us are concerned about the ability to ramp up and hire enough staff quickly enough. One thing I'm concerned about is with these significant changes in the timelines and processes that the province is mandating as of July 1st. What are you hearing from your members? I guess my concern is that we're going to get a massive amount of applications July 1st, trying to take advantage of the legislated shorter timeframes. And in this transition to when we are trying to hire and build up, that's going to be a significant strain on our resources. Are those concerns founded, or what are you hearing from the local industry?
I appreciate that concern. I have not heard from members that there's going to be that they're holding back items now. For 2 months from now, when these new timelines will come into place, because obviously the timelines are much farther straightened out. I have to admit, I have not heard that kind of concern. I forgot this first part of the question. Sorry.
Well, that was basically it about whether or not we're going to see a real increase in applications once July 1st hits. So you've answered that. Thank you. You had mentioned about the issue with concurrent site plan and zoning, and you mentioned perhaps a 150-day window to consider those. Can you just elaborate a bit on what GOBA envisions as a solution for those kind of concurrent applications?
Well, essentially, it would be in the province revising some legislation to allow the concurrent application to happen. It's staff's position that basically the legislation does not allow you to put both of those things in and have them considered in parallel. that they have to be split up, whereas our current process is to allow those two things to be considered at the same time, because they do influence each other at the end. So we would rather see, if that's staff's concern, we'd rather see the province amend the legislation. We feel that there is a positive reception to doing so, because obviously we're not also the only jurisdiction that does concurrent applications. So we've got some, we're positive that we could see movement on that from the provincial side. So it's obviously on the municipality to perhaps request it, but we're happy to, support that, either in our own letter to the minister or in a joint letter to the minister or what have you. We think that's a positive change that could come on, frankly, what's just an unintended consequence of the legislation.
Okay. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Councillor Gower. I will just make note that the mayor's office has reached out to the province to begin that discussion around concurrent site plan and zoning applications. So we'll see where that ends up. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jason, for coming out today. The motion that Councillor Johnson put forward about pre-consultation, in my experience, I found it very positive to have pre-consultation with community groups and before you apply. And it's actually been very positive that because they don't like it when you've applied and then they're told that's it. So I just want to know if there's an openness to that, because it's already been going on and it's been very successful. So just wanted feedback.
Much like my answer to Councillor Luloff, I don't lead any specific applications myself, and I've never been in the room for a pre-consultation discussion. I would again suggest perhaps that's a question better offered to someone who has done that sort of thing, like Murray later on, not to put all the burden on Murray, but yeah, given that I actually don't do that sort of thing, I perhaps would best not be the best person to speak to it.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Seeing no other questions for Mr. Burgraff. Jason, thank you very much for delegation today. And we'll now let Murray answer all the questions that Mr. Burgraff was unable to. Mr. Chown, you have 5 minutes to make a presentation to the joint committee.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I've got things showing up on the wrong screens. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and it sounds like the members of committee may have a lot of questions for me when I'm done, which I hadn't necessarily anticipated, but I'm looking forward to it. Let me start by saying I think that some of the concerns that I'm going to express today may be addressed by, depending upon how staff respond to Councillor Gower's motion with respect to dispute resolution. I registered to speak today because I wanted to publicly state the skepticism that I have with respect to how this process is going to unfold. And I think my skepticism is shared by many of the home builders in the city of Ottawa. And it relates to two things. Firstly, is a concern not so much about the list of plans and studies that are in the bylaw before you today, but the ability of the file lead to determine on their own which of those studies will be required for a complete application. And at the moment, there's no ability for the applicant to dispute that list or argue that there are studies and plans being requested that are inappropriate for the application. And that's leading to two things. I have clients who are abandoning applications because of the list of required plans and studies, with the result that instead of a project going through site plan where you might be getting a low-rise apartment building with 30, 40, 60 new homes being developed. Instead, they're just going to come forward with a couple of 10-unit low-rise apartment buildings, avoid site plan, avoid all of these studies, but miss the opportunity to build far more residential units and help to achieve the city's intensification targets as set out in your official plan. So we need a process to make sure that the studies that are being requested are in fact appropriate and reasonable. The time and cost to prepare those studies are intimidating to the smaller builders in the city of Ottawa, and we can talk more about that. The second aspect of this, and I think is of greater concern, is we may end up in an infinite loop at phase 3 of the pre-consultation process. What the process is set out in the bylaw that's before you today, and as staff have described it to the industry, is we are not going to deem your application complete until we are satisfied that all of the plans and studies that we've requested meet the terms of reference for those plans or studies, so that if any one of those plans or studies, in the opinion of the planner, is deficient and doesn't meet the terms of reference, then you will not be deemed complete. And I can see a situation where we just go around and around and around, and every time we go around, we pay another fee, a pre-consultation fee, but we don't ever cross the goal line. And so there's a great deal of pressure with respect on how staff respond to the motion from Councillor Gower with respect to dispute resolution. Our clients, in fact, are rushing to file before July 1st, not the reverse. They're not holding off saying, oh, we're going to wait until July 1st, so we're subject to the Bill 109 timelines, because we may never get to a point where our application is deemed complete. So rather than wait till July 1st, we're rushing to file now so that we actually know what we're dealing with. We know that our applications will be deemed complete and will be processed in due course. If we wait until July the 2nd or 3rd to file, our applications may never be deemed complete. We never may build the houses that the city has pledged to build by 2031. 151,000, the city's not building those houses. The city isn't going to deliver on that pledge. The home builders have to deliver on that pledge. And I'm not sure how they're going to do that if our applications are never deemed complete. I'm a little skeptical, a little cynical, but there's the possibility that we're going to get into this loop at phase 3 of the pre-consultation process and never have our applications deemed complete. My time is up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chan. Are there any questions for Murray, Kathy, or Councillor Curry?
Thank you, Mr. Chown. So we're just talking about this here, this councillors here. And just to be clear, so you see this new version as giving the planners a ton of power. So because the planners could keep you stuck in an infinite loop, you potentially may never, ever get something to go forward. But if we went with the old process, what happens is the councillors had more power and they're worried about whether they'll get elected or not, whereas planners are not. So in fact, this puts all the power to a planner who doesn't care if if you put pressure on them or not. I think that's what the province was trying to do. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think the province is trying to make sure this is not in the hands of councillors who are swayed by residents and worried about votes and all those other things. I'm not saying any of us would only make a decision on that. I'm just saying the thinking of the province is that they would rather that the planners have more power. Is that not how you see the purpose of this?
I think we're maybe confusing different pieces of legislation. The province did delegate site plan approval to staff and take the power away from councillors to deal with site plan approvals. What's before you today has nothing to do with that decision of the province. What's before you today is the decision of the province to impose unrealistic timelines on the city with the penalty that if you don't meet those timelines, you have to refund application fees. Two different decisions, two different pieces of legislation. And we can talk about the first one if you want, but in terms of the one that's before you today, the difficulty, and staff are in, the city's in a very difficult situation, but the difficulty today is what staff have done as opposed to the current process, is they've front loaded all of that consultation work without any prescriptive timelines that they can be held to. And if they fail to meet those timelines, that we and our clients have some recourse. We're entirely at the mercy of staff in terms of getting our applications deemed complete.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I'm really that confused though. What I see here is that staff have all the power to stop an application from going forward. Really? And is that not what the province wanted? Eventually, and what we were just talking about is that we could put in a process where we would then see how long does this pre-consultation phase take? Is it taking years? Like what is happening during that? I mean, there are ways to moderate that, but that is in fact what could be happening with what we're putting forward, just so that we're all clear. But anyways, we'll ask more questions. Thanks, Murray.
If I may, I think Councillor Gower's direction would address that. And I'm anticipating, I'm guessing that staff are going to take that direction. And there is also, I believe, a mechanism whereby if staff refuse to deem an application complete, there is the alternative of going to the OLT to have the tribunal determine that the application is complete. Councillor Troster?
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Murray. So we all understand that the timelines being imposed in this legislation are dramatically tighter than what the city is currently meeting. And I will note that the timelines involve calendar days, not business days. So you know, a developer could submit an application December 1st, and we'd have to decide before the end of the month during Christmas vacation, you know, or when large parts of the world are shut down. So my question to you is, assuming that the province doesn't change these deadlines and these obligations in Bill 109, how else would you see us being able to meet those deadlines without requiring all of that information up front in the pre-application phase, Murray? Do you have a suggestion for how you would do it differently and still meet those timelines?
I don't think staff had any alternative in terms of what they're recommending to you today. And as I say, I'm very sympathetic to them. They didn't bring this upon themselves. The provincial government imposed this on all of us. And I think that as Jason has articulated, I think most of the municipalities across the province, big and small, are reacting the same way. I'm seeing the same response even at home in the town of Arnprior, where they're going to front load the process so they can meet the timelines. I don't think that there is another solution, but I think what we just need to monitor this very closely, and I would suggest maybe reporting back at the end of the year on how things are going. And two, you know, certainly carry Councillor Gower's motion with respect to exploring somehow some kind of dispute resolution so that we can avoid unnecessary delays in the pre-consultation process. But I don't think that staff had any alternative but to recommend moving that work forward of the deemed complete date. The problem we're going to have is how does that function, and does it, at the end of the day, are we going to be taking longer to process applications going forward than we have in the past? And certainly we at the industry think it's actually going to take longer because this pre-consultation process no longer has any critical statutory timelines associated with it. We're going to have to see how it plays out, but I don't think there is an alternative in terms of approach. I don't have an alternative.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Mr. Chow. Nice to meet you. I was just wondering if you could, yes, thank you. I've heard your name before, but we've not met. So I was curious to know what your impressions are with the increased reporting guidelines that are also coming from the province when it comes to housing starts and all the different things that we're being asked to report. Is there an opportunity there, given some of the other pieces that staff have put forward with increased monitoring over the next 18 months, something that you'd like to see come forward really specifically that would help you to to watch that data that's important to you? I feel like there are some pieces of that already in the report. So if there's further detail that you're asking for, maybe you could let us know.
I think specifically in terms of the concern that I've raised this morning, councillors, I think we need to track the time it takes to get through that pre-consultation process. Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? What's it going to take? But it's not going to be weeks, which is why I say my clients are rushing to file before July 1st, because if we're into this new process, we're not deeming applications complete on July the 2nd. We're starting the pre-consultation process the day after this goes to council, which I think is the 14th. So we're only just starting the pre-consultation process for those new applications. As of June the 15th or 16th, whatever it is, we're going to go through a 3 or a 4 month process before those applications are deemed complete. So you're not actually going to have any new applications deemed complete in July. It's not going to happen. You might see new applications deemed complete in August or September as we get through that pre-consultation process. I went off on a tangent, I'm sorry. So we need to track how long it takes to get through that pre-consultation process. I'm afraid it's going to be a long, long time.
Okay, so I'm sure we'll have questions for staff just to clarify some of the language around their monitoring reporting that they're planning to undertake. And of course, also the constellation of the other choices that they're making to ensure that expediency. Thank you.
Thank you.
On the pre-consultation process, it's a new process that's in front of us. So understandably, there's concern from many stakeholders about how it will work. What do you think is reasonable for a time frame? Like if we were to set some expectations or targets for staff in terms of how many weeks or months for a fairly well-formed application that's not an extreme level of complexity, what would your expectation be for how long a pre-consultation period should take?
So I can't recall if it was part of Emily's presentation to you this morning, but what staff have suggested to us is that their response to each one of those pre-consultations would take up to 21 days or 3 weeks. So that's the response. It doesn't include the time that the proponent needs to respond to the response. So we have our initial pre-consultation meeting where we show the initial project to staff. Sometime within the next 3 weeks, staff come back and say, well, here are our comments, and here's a preliminary list of required plans and studies. We then go away and prepare those preliminary plans and studies and possibly refine the project. What is that going to take? A month and a half? We come back for the second pre-consultation and we go through the same dance, right? We show the revised proposal, we provide the preliminary plans and studies, staff respond within 3 weeks and say, we need more studies, we need to refine these studies. We go away, we prepare more studies or refine studies, that's another month. Then we come back for the third pre-consultation with all of our plans and studies, and we hope and pray that staff receive those and say, yep, you've ticked all the boxes, you're good to go. So what have we got? We've got 3 weeks, call it, and then we've got a month, another 3 weeks, another month. We're 3.5 months before we even get to the third pre-consultation, hoping that when we get to the third pre-consultation, we're good to go. But there's still another 3-week period for staff to tell us whether we're good to go or to say, no, I'm really sorry. This plan, this study doesn't meet the expectations or the requirements or the terms of reference. Go back, do it again, spend another month or two, pay us another fee. So we're in a process now that is 4 to 5 months, maybe longer, before we're deemed complete.
So, okay, so 3.5 to 5 months depending how it goes. What is it? How does that compare to pre-consultation now? How long is it usually a typical application, medium size, average application between the first pre-consultation meeting and when it gets submitted formally? What is that time frame?
2 months, 2 months and we're in.
Okay. My motion on the dispute resolution is deliberately open-ended because I don't think any of us are ready to prescribe what that's going to look like. But do you have any recommendations or any other examples of similar or appropriate dispute resolution processes that could be a model for us to look at?
Really good question. I'm not sure what the answer is, because if staff are asking for reports which we think are inappropriate for an application, and as I say, I've had that experience on a file that I have right now on a simple minor rezoning application where staff are asking for a whole bunch of plans and studies that look awful lot like the plans and studies that they would normally require for a site plan application, but the project isn't subject to site plan approval. I've raised concerns. Did my concerns get me anywhere? Maybe they took 1 or 2 studies off that list, but certainly not all of the studies that we had issue with. So we're going to abandon the minor zoning application. We're going to follow another path. What dispute, how could we elevate that in terms of dispute resolution? Right now, the only recourse we have is to go up the chain of command and take up all of Derek Moody's time with these types of issues, which is unreasonable and inappropriate. So I don't know do we need an ombudsman or something like that in terms of a person who is not, part of the department, part of the decision making on those processes, but who can step back and offer an opinion as to whether this is reasonable or not, and avoid the time and costs and delays of an appeal to go to the OLT. Chair Leeper indicated that that's an option available to us. I understand it's only available to us if we actually file an application and take the position it's complete and staff refuse to deem it complete. But we're not, with the process that's set out to you today, we can't actually file that application. The third pre-consultation process doesn't get us there. We only get to that date when staff open the door and say, you're allowed to walk through the door and file the application. Otherwise, we never get there. And therefore, we don't ever get to a point where we have those appeal rights under the Planning Act. So maybe it's an ombudsman that can offer an arm's length perspective on the question as to whether or not the required plans and studies are appropriate. And secondly, to my second point, whether or not the plans and studies are actually sufficient for the application to be deemed complete. But it needs to be somebody who's outside of that process, and that person certainly doesn't exist today, but maybe it's a new position that's created that's kind of outside of the department. I don't, just thinking out loud.
The other thing that counteracts, I hope it's not staff's intention. I don't think it is to unreasonably delay through the pre-consultation process. We are going to be getting regular reports on this. And if all of a sudden we start seeing that pre-consultations are taking on average 6 months, 9 months, a year, that's not going to be acceptable to our committee or our council. It's not going to be acceptable to the provincial government either. I think that's another mechanism that's important through the reporting that will, I think, have some real, give some teeth or give some push to staff to make sure that applications are being processed as efficiently as possible. But obviously, this is all new territory, all new processes, and we'll need to continue to develop and learn. And we may be back a year or two from now with, I'm sure we will be actually, with recommendations on how we can further streamline and improve. So thank you for your thoughts today, Murray. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you for the questions.
Glenn, we've heard from the industry, and do you want to ask staff if they'd be willing to take that direction now? Yeah.
The dispute resolution is a motion.
Oh, sorry, on the I mixed those up. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Murray. I think you know the question I was going to ask because I already asked it to Jason and he pitched it to you. So, and it's about having the public consultation during that pre-consultation period, which I find usually developers are keen to do usually. And it's been successful because the public feels they have more say before you file. So it's so we've gone through it a few times and I just wanted to get your feedback.
So thank you for the question, Councillor. I think there's really two aspects to the question. And one relates to one of the motions that's been tabled this morning, and that is the practice that we're following with applications in some of the inner city wards and neighborhoods where the community associations are invited to our initial pre-consultation meeting. They're invited to that meeting on the understanding that they've signed a non-disclosure agreement so that they aren't at liberty to take that conversation back to their membership or to the community, but they are at the table when we have the initial discussions with respect to the project, and they have the opportunity to provide comments on the project. And I guess the expectation would be with the 3-stage pre-consultation process, maybe get clarification from staff that they would be invited to each of those 3 stages. I'm not clear on that. And the motion that would look at exploring that practice to other wards, certainly I don't think anybody in the industry would have any objections to that. The other aspect to public consultation, which I think is your experience in your ward, which is where the proponents will, through your office, arrange for informal information meetings with the community and the neighborhoods about the project, either before they filed or shortly after they filed an application to initiate that dialogue. As long as that's not prescribed, and I say that because I don't think two things. One is I don't think the municipality has the authority to prescribe it, and the second is how it fits into the timeline is something that we would have to think about. But I don't think that this process or this report in any way prevents us and our clients from continuing to do what they've already done in terms of reaching out to the community associations, either directly or through the councillor's offices. I don't see that changing in terms of an approach, but it will depend, it'll vary on a project by project basis.
Well, that's been my experience, is that it's already being done, and I don't see it as a delay. Usually it's pretty positive to go to the community at that stage. It's appreciated by the communities and the developers hear what the top concerns are. So I hope to see that continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kavanaugh. Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair. Just on that theme, though, I've heard Mr. Chown raise concerns about delays during the pre-consultation phase and files being held up. And for me, this is the critical piece or component of this journey. And the public absolutely has to be engaged in this process. And it's not just community associations. How many pre-consultations on files for River Ward happen in any given year that I don't even know about because I haven't been included yet, that haven't seen the light of day and don't make the light of day? And we're going to suggest that volunteer members of community associations are going to participate 3 different pre-consult phases for 25 files. That's not going to happen. I appreciate them having the opportunity because some applications may be more engaged than others. But I just want to reinforce, Mr. Chown, that we're going to have to come to an agreement on, even though the legislation says the public meeting that is required is the actual planning and housing committee meeting, the public expects a lot more than that. public wants to be engaged in applications. They want to have input before the application is filed, and they want to be able to impact what the final product looks like. And if it's continue as normal, then that's great. But I'm just getting from your comments, you're concerned about the pre-application process and the amount of time that this process will take. And I want to make sure that we reinforce with you the importance of engaging the public during this process. So if you have any additional comments, I'm all ears.
Councillor, just to sum up, I don't think there's anything in the report or the recommendations before you today that would preclude developers from continuing to the practice of reaching out to the community as they have today. That's a separate piece. If they're prepared to do that, they can continue to do that. It won't affect the timelines.
Okay. I just thought I heard you at the beginning say you were concerned about the pre-consultation phase. You weren't specifically mentioning public consultation. You were concerned about a planner potentially holding this up. I do believe that planners work in good faith, and I don't believe there are planners that are going to deliberately hold up files unless there are legitimate issues that need to be addressed and ironed out. And I want them to continue to do that because they are ultimately working on behalf of the people of Ottawa. I'll just say, though, if you could comment, even though there may be an increase to the timelines associated with the new pre-consultation process, at the end of the day, the provincial legislation is shaving off a significant amount of time at the back end that we've seen the current average times to deal with either a zoning bylaw amendment application or site plan application, and the new timelines that municipalities are asked to work under. Do you acknowledge that there will be a net increase or net savings in time for an average application?
I'm glad you put that question to me because my response is in the negative. I believe that the legislative changes made by the province of Ontario are not going to achieve the goal of getting projects approved faster. I believe the exact opposite is the result of the legislative changes. And I think it's truly unfortunate. I think that the government may have been motivated to try and help move things along by shortening the timelines and imposing this burden on the city that you're going to have to refund fees if you don't meet the timelines. But are we going to end up with processing applications faster than we were before? This is where my cynicism kicks in, Councillor Brockington, is I honestly believe the answer is no, that it's going to take longer to process applications under this new regime than it did before. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my expectation.
Okay, thank you for that. This is the importance of why we will need to measure this very closely and have reports coming back to committee, because potentially it's lose, lose, lose. Developers see a longer process. The public is less engaged because there's less opportunities and shortened timelines to be engaged, and the city ultimately will lose revenues that it needs to support the programming and service. So yes, I hope we're all wrong in this case and that it actually will work, but it is new territory that we're venturing down, and we absolutely have to monitor this in the short term to make sure we are achieving those timelines. Thanks, Murray.
Thanks for the questions.
Thank you, Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the delegations that have come before us. I also want to just thank Councillor Johnson and Councillor Dudas for their motions in particular. I'm very supportive of those, and think that will help. I know Councillor Gower's also put forward a motion around dispute resolution, which is appreciated. I just to you, Mr. Chown, I think you've talked a lot about the pre-application process. I wanted to get your thoughts on the resubmission process, or I guess the lack of resubmission option that would take place as a result of these changes. And I'll just preface that by saying that many of the applications, I think you feel the same way, in my ward anyway, I think have been dramatically improved through that iterative process that the province is essentially forcing us to get rid of. So, I've proposed to staff a condition where there could be, for minor amendments, and we'd have to define that there would still be an allowable resubmission. So just want to get your take on that, and on the resubmission process in particular after the application's been submitted.
Thank you very much for that question, because I don't think it's come up in either in the presentation or in any of the other questions this morning. So yes, you're correct that the understanding is that there's no time for that iterative process, that back and forth that occurs today after an application has been filed. And what staff have indicated to the industry is that if you're going to, significantly revise the application after it's been deemed complete, you need to withdraw that application and resubmit at stage 3 of the pre-consultation, which is going to cost time and money. But I think, and you may want to put the question to staff. Staff have also indicated to us, though, that they may make a recommendation for approval of something that's slightly different than what was actually submitted based on that feedback that they do receive during the official review period. So there is the opportunity, as I understand it, for staff to approve something that is different from what was actually submitted without requiring the applicant or the proponent to start that process all over again. So you may want to put the question to staff as well, but that's my understanding of the process.
Well, that's appreciated. And I think it, definitely helpful to get clarification on staff. And I think some of these motions will speak to some of the, perhaps that iterative process that we might be missing here. And obviously, I think this is an example of if there's legislation put in place without listening to some of the concerns, we may end up with that lose-lose-lose situation that Councillor Brockington described, where no one is really happy, and we're not achieving the objectives that we all have talked about, which is that housing approvals that are going to be streamlined for our communities that make sense. And so I think in this case, we're not in a good spot, and we're responding to bad legislation. So look, thanks, Mr. Chown, for being here, and looking forward to more of the discussion, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Menard. I don't see any other questions for Murray. So, Mr. Chown, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the questions.
The staff are available for any questions that members of the Joint Committee may have. Councillor Tierney?
Great. Thank you very much, Mr.
I'm sorry. Oh, we missed one. There is one more delegation. Mr. Ostrowski, I apologize. I know you're no stranger to the committee. You have 5 minutes to make a presentation. I apologize.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Ostrowski was on the call. He might have dropped off. We'll just take a moment to see if we can confirm he's here.
We'll wait a minute or so, and then if not, we'll just move to questions to staff, and then allow Mr. Ostrowski to speak when he is able to rejoin us.
Hello. My apologies. I was rejoining.
No problem at all. We can see and hear you. Feel free to take your 5 minutes.
Thank you. So I'm here on behalf of Make Housing Affordable, which comes before this committee quite often. And Canada currently ranks 64th out of 120 countries, or at least it did in 2020, in the world in development approval efficiency for routine building projects. And again, in 2020, on average, each month adds about $1.46 per square foot. So this report, and implementing Bill 109 dealing with kind of efficiency in the planning process does have some good things. It has simplification of some studies. It has reductions in some consultations. Community input is already given in the official and the secondary plans. So when it comes to some developments, we feel that there's not a need to have as much community input. And delegations to staff minor bylaw amendments, that a lot of the questions that come up before the council are already answered just by referencing the official plan. And so this politically fraught process complicates things. And of course, the internal streamlining of processes. However, that kind of a common theme in this report is the idea that it's really being done to just conform to what the province is imposing. But even if the province doesn't signal something with regards to their desires, doesn't mean the city can't go above and beyond. So this report could have been about innovation and streamlining potentially, not just about doing sort of the bare minimum to technically complying with the provincial guidelines and just sort of there's that reshuffling of the process with a new phase structure and making it more expensive by increasing fees. And we feel the city should have used this opportunity to be more proactive about accelerating the construction of housing instead. There's obviously a lot to be unhappy about in the province's top-down approach to housing and municipal policy. But the solution to that is not to begrudgingly just put forward something to deal with it, but to be bold and innovative. And so the city kind of, obviously this is, a lot of this is, the province's approach, but the city doing this thing today risks the province returning with even more requirements and taking even more power out of the city's hands. And so we would hope that kind of in the month before the implementation of this report, that committee is able to encourage staff to look at even more ways to potentially streamline the entire process. For example, if when it comes to the zoning bylaw review, that we have the official plan implemented and we have the zoning bylaw that will only be implemented in 2025. In the meantime, staff have to actually work on all of these projects, and it's a tremendous waste of staff time to have to examine zoning bylaws to see if they should be approved or not when the official plan would already permit it. So that's sort of a use of staff time that would be better spent on other things. Other things like other provinces have in the past, they've had pre-approval of a bunch of standard designs that can be implemented by right citywide. So just sort of innovative strategies like that can be used to really maximize staff's time, as Councillor Leeper rightly noted in the CBC this week, that nobody wants unsafe projects to slip through or shoddy projects. So allowing staff to focus more on the projects that really need it would be beneficial to everyone. So just in conclusion, we hope that this can be seen by the city as more than just sort of we're complying with something the province is telling us, and really as a way to innovate and achieve more in streamlining approval and getting more housing built. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ostrowski. Are there any questions for the delegation? I think most of the hands are up for staff. Just catch my eye if you want to pose anything. No. Thank you very much, Joseph. I appreciate your delegation today. So with that, now we'll move into questions. Staff, Councillor Tierney, please feel free.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank you for the report. I know it's a weird world out there right now, and the Ford government is pressing ahead with many things. They're even speeding along legislation today to split Peel up and do all these things fast and furious. But we also do want to make sure things are done correct. And when it comes to Bill 109, it's about building faster, obviously, and streamlining things. And some of the questions and delegations, I heard some things today. First of all, hiring planners is a bit of a challenge. How assured do you feel you'll be able to actually hire the appropriate number of people in that department, Derek?
So the mix that we put for you is they're not all planners. There's a mixture of planners and engineers. Right. There's certain specializations with respect to forestry or, a lot of those staff that are identified are actually within other departments that provide feedback and information into the development review process. And the rationale for that is to give them dedicated resources to focus on development applications and meet the timelines within our circulation period. Today they're working off the side of their desk. Sorry, I think within the planning realm, we have done a reasonably good job at attracting planning talent. We have different programs where we can bring in junior staff as co-op students and sort of, you know, not indoctrinate them, but like bring them in early and get them looking at the city as a positive employment option for them. With the implementation of our team approach, we're also hopeful that, you know, bringing in, that will give us an opportunity to bring in junior staff or potentially even staff that don't have professional planning qualifications to fulfill some of those tasks that are currently being done by planners. With respect to engineers, we have a program where we currently bring in junior engineers fresh out of school, you know, work with them as they get their engineering designation. And that has been a great tool to attract engineers. The other thing I will add that is I believe the city is an employer of choice for female engineers. We have a comprehensive benefits and employment package that I think is aggressive in that industry. And certainly I think we've had a great success in hiring young female engineers into the fold. And so I think we'll be successful. Until we go to market, we won't know for sure. I'm conscious that there are other municipalities across the province that are also in a hiring mode. City of Toronto, I think, is looking to add 150 staff to their planning department. And so, you know, I'm conscious that there's only so many grads out there, but I do think that as a city, we are a good employer. You know, we have had decent success in attracting good talent to date.
And that gives me hope, obviously. And the reason that this is coming up to us just at a conference for 5 days in Toronto at FCM, and all municipalities, especially obviously Ontario municipalities, we're all worried about the same thing. So from a reporting perspective on hiring, as well as I did hear about the pre-consult phase, there was talks of reporting. What is some kind of report that can come back on whether it's hiring, whether it's the length of the pre-consultation phase versus time of application? Derek, I know it's resource intensive, but I think it's important that we stay on top of this one. Would this be like a quarterly report that could be brought back to planning committee, for example?
Mr. Chair, the recommendation 9 does speak to monitoring, and those items that you've talked about will form part of that, but that is identified in recommendation 9 as to come back to committee and council to give them some of that information. The recommendation that's before you is to report annually as opposed to quarterly, but we certainly are supportive of keeping council in the loop with respect to our progress.
Okay, great. That's all my questions for now, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Kitts.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Lots of information. I'm wondering if we are budgeting for risk at all. I think it's safe to assume we won't meet the timelines 100% of the time. And there's also, I think, a risk that will be at the tribunal more. So are we dedicating resources to that proactively?
At this point, we don't. I certainly do appreciate the comments with respect to risk of being at the tribunal. You know, the task that's been put forward to us in planning is to meet these timelines, and that is what we're working towards, as opposed to building in a slippage at this point. I do appreciate your comments with respect to the potential to be at the board more, and that could have an impact on us, especially as we're faced with making a decision to meet those timelines that, may not necessarily be the decision the applicants are looking for. And so I recognize it. I think that the direction that's been provided to analyze some of that with respect to the legal services budget as part of the process for 2024 will address some of that, but it's something we're going to have to continue to monitor and identify how much time we're spending at the board and what the impact that is on our overall operations.
Okay, great. And that will be part of the reporting back to council?
So the piece, the analysis with respect to the legal budget will be part of that, but certainly we can report to council as to the amount of time or the amount of decisions that end up getting appealed as a result of the faster timelines.
Okay, thank you. I think that'll be something we'll have to keep our eye out for. Want to thank Councillor Johnson for your motion. I think the education piece with CAs is important, and I'm hoping we can also get some sort of jargon-free language really geared to residents about these changes. because I'm concerned about the less civically engaged members of our community. Residents aren't always looking up dev apps. They're not always delegating at committee, but they start paying attention when a bulldozer starts moving earth around on a site near their house. So I think they think there's still that expectation that councillors do have influence and a say over site plan. And I think it's going to take some real work combating that narrative. So if staff could assist with that, I think we're all going to need to sing from the same songbook on this one to really drive the message home.
The city staff are looking at updating the planning primer to make sure that it reflects the current information. And that has been a great tool in communicating that message out to residents that are, somewhat civically engaged or in the learning process about the planning process. We will be updating the city's webpage as well as we get approval for the new process and outlining what that process is that may be a tool that council could use to help share that information with the community.
Okay. And on that same note, I believe that there is a responsibility for Planning Act applications that the city needs to be notified when site alterations begin. Am I understanding that correctly? Like the early earthworks?
We do have a site alteration bylaw that does have provisions within it, but with respect to development applications, early simple earthworks on a subdivision as an example is not something that we typically require notification on. We do issue a commence work as part of our process before they can start doing actual construction. So before they can lay any sewer pipes or water pipes, start to build roads, we do require them to have a commence work notification so that we can ensure we've got an appropriate inspection on site.
Okay. Maybe I'll ruminate on that a little bit more. I also want to thank Councillor Gower for your direction on the legal side of things. I had the same question. And on the same token, do transportation planning staff also have the capacity to ramp up?
As part of this, I think there are some staff within the transportation planning that will be added to the to the cohort. A lot of that transportation process, is already front-ended through process that was approved by council a couple of years ago.
Okay, wonderful. That was the answer I was looking for. As you know, I think the connectivity piece is critical. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Lowe.
Thank you, Chair. It seems like, I may be uninformed on this, but it seems like 196 days for site plan control and 178 days for the zoning bylaw amendment it does seem like a lot, but that may be just from an outsider's point of view. How did we get to a point where our timelines were that long? And I'm not suggesting that anything was done wrong, but how did we get to a point where that is our current timeline? And how does that compare to let's say other Ontario municipalities?
I think the current culture within the city has been always to work towards yes, and to work towards a supportive application where we can come forward with a positive recommendation. That 196 days on a site plan is not all within the city's purview. A lot of that time is within the applicant's purview as they formulate the response to our applications. And so, that is a calendar days, all things considered, and we don't control how long applicants take to refile their applications. Certainly, over time, our process has become more complex and we're looking at more things, today than we were 10 years ago. But that is, we've also seen application volumes increase, which contributes to the overall workload, which contributes to the overall timelines, which is part of the rationale for adding additional staff today. It's not one thing, Councillor or Chair, it's a variety of things that layer into that. And it's also worth noting that that's not all staff review time.
That's good to know. And how is that number of the additional FTEs that you need determined? Was that based on the averages of applications over the last X number of years?
So there was a review that was done with our our colleagues in other departments. First and foremost, we approached our other colleagues to determine what they would need in order to meet the timelines that we're looking to impose upon them through Bill 109, and to ensure that they had dedicated resources identified to respond to our questions. That accounts for, I think it's 17 of the total. The additional 15, are within our group. And we've looked at ways, as we look to implement the team approach, we are looking at what types of positions we will need to make those teams work better. It's not just about the number of applications. It's, there is an argument that we're not increasing the volume of applications, so we're not increasing the volume of work. What we are looking to do is increase the service level that we're providing to them and move them through the process quicker. And so that is, we went through a fairly high level analysis to determine what each team was going to need to work as a full complement, and built it around that.
Thank you. Last question. So going on to the some of the comments that were made by one of the public delegations about the pre-consultation process. I think he suggested that it's looking like 3.5 to 5 months for the pre-consult, assuming there's no infinite loop or whatever you mentioned there. Do you agree or disagree with that suggestion at all, or do you, or is there some enhancement to that those figures?
I think there's a couple of things that are worth touching on. While it may be the speaker's experience that he's ready to go in 2 months, I think a typical timeline between when we see a pre-application consultation and when we actually see the application generally is greater than that. It's greater. I would have said answer that question in a 3 to 6 month window. Appreciating that some people are ready to go, before they submit their pre-application consultation and they have to check the box and they come in the next day with an application. Typically, if they're actually engaging in the process, there is time that they require to complete the studies after that meeting, and a 3 to 6 month window is not out of the norm. With respect to the new timelines, if I can just speak to that process a little bit, the first phase is very similar to what we have today. So today we have a pre-consultation meeting. The first phase in our process is essentially the same one. It's on us to make sure we identify everything early, and that we are, we're coming to that meeting prepared and ready to identify every requirement that they're going to have. The phase 2 of that process really only kicks in if they make a significant change to their application. And so today, we see some people come in with a pre-consultation. When they actually submit, the project doesn't look the same. We're saying if they're going to make changes to their application, they're going to have to go through phase 2 so that we're sure they're not missing studies or requirements, and we don't have time to come in as we do today and say, oh, you added another 3 floors, we need you to update your transportation study, or we need an additional level of study in order to process that application. If applications don't change from phase 1 to when they submit, phase 2 can be waived. Phase 3 is essentially deeming the application complete. And we have that process in our system today where staff deem that application complete. That happens before council is engaged or before the public knows that there's an application. Essentially, the step is similar to what we are today. What we're changing, though, is that staff's review in that phase will be more comprehensive. We'll be looking at those reports to ensure that they're consistent with one another, that they meet the requirements that were identified in the pre-application consultation, and that they meet the terms of reference of the studies. And so it is a more comprehensive review than we currently do to deem an application complete, but it is, we have a step in our process today to deem applications complete before the public gets notified and before council is made aware of a file. And so that process, I think if I'm surmising, and I hope I'm not communicating what I think the speaker's concern was, is that he's going to submit an application and we're going to say it's not adequate, and we're going to end up in a loop. And I appreciate the source of his cynicism. It will be on staff and on management to ensure that we're not digging too far into the applications to the direction or the motion that's coming. I think staff are supportive of a form of dispute resolution if we get into that. But we do have a step in our process today to deem it complete. And should they not agree with us in that step, today they have the ability to go to the OLT. Tomorrow they will have the ability to go to the OLT. So we're not changing that regard. I think it's, we will have to work through that cynicism and skepticism with the industry. I appreciate where they're coming from, and we are committed to continue to work with them to work through them.
Okay, and I know I said that was my last question. The pre-consultation is going to be lengthened a little bit then as a result, right? But with the change in timelines after the completion, like, will that kind of offset it? So in terms of the overall timeline, like, will applicants see any major changes at all?
So the process we are building around within our procedures is to have a 21-day turnaround from the time they submit their studies to determine if it's adequate or not. If it is adequate, I think they will yield significant savings in timeline, because from that point forward, they will have either the 60 or 90 days. If we do have to go through a resubmission and it's not adequate, as we have to do that, the time savings reduces.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lowe. Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to my colleagues for their motions. I think they were all very positive. I just came back from FCM as well, and I did get a chance to talk to a planner in Toronto. So we did a walking tour of some neighborhoods about missing middle. I know they're concerned as well. What are we learning from other municipalities on this process?
Through the chair, and thank you for the question. At the very beginning of this process and the province dropping this legislation, we actually triggered a municipal roundtable session with all of the other major urban municipalities across Ontario, where we got to collaborate with them and understand a path forward and interpret the legislation. Most of the legislation in Bill 109 is interpretive, and there are different approaches that could be tackled in order to put in place business procedures to address the new timelines. All in all, most of the urban municipalities, and I think Murray and others have already spoken to this, are moving in the same direction of putting a lot more emphasis on pre-consultation in order to ensure that we get good applications in at the beginning. That will set Ontario municipalities up to be able to process applications in the timeline that is allotted by the province. In addition to that, most of the other Ontario municipalities are also significantly increasing their pre-consultation fees. Some of them are upwards of $15,000 for pre-consultation. We are not doing that here before you today. It's a bit of a different topic, but we are continuing with the same pre-consultation fee that we have currently, which I think is in the range of $670 some odd dollars. But many other Ontario municipalities are revamping their pre-consultation process, revamping their fees in order to put a lot more emphasis on that stage.
Thank you, very appreciated. I think one of the things that public might worry about in terms of the shorter deadlines is that something will get missed, that we're rushing, that because we have to rush, and they're worried about what could possibly be missed. What is the most important thing in terms of the checklist? What is the one that is probably the most time consuming?
In our current process, issue resolution is something that takes a lot of our time in working through issues. I think where the biggest difference today is staff are going to be faced with the decision of either supporting an application or not supporting an application. And with respect to zoning, we have, there's 4 options available to us. We can approve it as it was submitted. We can refuse it. We can approve it with a holding provision. So if there is a piece of technical information that's still outstanding, for instance, if they have yet to adequately convince us that there's sanitary capacity or something of that nature, we can approve the zoning, saying we approve the intent of this building, but there's a final check and balance that's required in order for them to proceed to permit. The other thing we can do is approve it with modifications, either with or without the support of the applicant. And that's something that I think we're going to see more of. And typically that issue resolution stage that we fall into in our current process is where we are working towards bringing it forward with an approval recommendation. And so now we're going to be faced with those 4 options, and they may not always be positive.
I know that the public often, is concerned about that. You get very common questions about, you're building something new and it's going to overtax our water supply or whatever. And when we have the pre-consultation, these questions always come up, and I'm confident that they're being dealt with. And one of the things I found with pre-consultation is it's hard to get a city staff person to a pre-consultation to answer those questions about what's going, what the requirements are. We've talked about this already a bit, but can we have some sort of a file of education stuff that's ready for any meeting, because that would be, answer probably the most common questions. I know Charmaine has worked on these issues, but we need something that, as we know, the average public person doesn't deal with applications, but something's happening in their community, and they have to become experts all of a sudden. And we need background information for them to ask questions that are probably more pointed and relevant to the application that could be helpful. Because as Councillor Johnson's motion is, I think it's very important that we have that public consultation in the pre-consultation period. So I just want to get some feedback on what can we supply in terms of the education piece.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we will be updating all of our highlight sheets, our planning primer, all of the education awareness. I will be completing like a template so that can be used at your different consultations. But really, it is about that education awareness piece. And as was mentioned several times, in plain language, so we can all understand it, not just the experts. So yes, that is part of the pieces that we will be doing. And I'll be happy to work with the counselors. I always like to get your feedback. Is this in plain language enough?
Thank you. When I look at the average agenda for planning committee, there's usually quite a few files that we don't even have to worry about. They just go through. They've been thoroughly vetted, and you don't have delegations. I'd say the majority. How do we sort them out so that we can, because there's ones that are not controversial at all, and others that I'd say probably a smaller percentage that are very controversial. So is that part of it, just in terms of the workload?
So the controversial files will be, benefiting from the same timelines that the non-controversial files will be on. And so that is a challenge that we have, that we've got to deal with the tough ones in the same timelines that we've got to deal with the more straightforward ones. One of the proposals that staff is putting forward is a direction to look at minor rezonings and whether there's an ability to deal with them in a different manner that may not require coming to committee and council. And so that is, something we can look at over time. And I think both committees deal with some of those applications that are fairly straightforward, that don't have the same benefit of that public discussion that a controversial file has, or don't need that same benefit. And so that is something that staff are prepared to look at. But, one of the challenges we face is, those really difficult files will take the same amount of time as, something that's very straightforward.
Thank you. And one of the increase in staffing, I just want to make sure it's been mentioned, as lawyers, unless we clone Tim over there. Is that part of it as well, that we get more lawyers?
So with the direction that's going to be followed, certainly the need for additional staff and legal services will be looked at, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kavanaugh. Vice Chair Gower.
Thanks, Chair. I'll start with the direction. This is the feasibility of planning services reserve. There's two main benefits to this. One, it would provide some financial stability because we know applications do go up and down each year, but it also addressed the concern from the industry, which is that any fees paid to planning services for applications, for meetings, remain within Planning Services Department. So the direction is that staff be directed to explore the feasibility of a planning services reserve and report back to council as part of the disposition of 2023 tax and rate supported operating surplus deficit. So would staff accept that as direction?
Through the chair, we have spoken with finance. I don't believe there's anyone here with finance, but finance has confirmed along with ourselves that we support that and we'll take that direction.
Okay, thank you. So a few questions. I'm convinced that the planning department has a very clear understanding of how imperative it is to meet these deadlines. There are other groups within the city that are not under planning services. Can you clarify for the internal circulation, you're proposing a shorter time. If staff from another department don't respond within that time frame, do you just assume that do you just move forward, or do you have to wait until certain groups of the city respond?
Chair, we have included in this report resources for those other groups that feed into our process to ensure that they have the resources to respond on time. You know, I think it would be aloof of me to say we will just move on, but it's going to be on the applicants to ensure we have on our file leads and the teams that are carrying those files to make sure that we have those comments, or if there is no comment, that we get them to acknowledge there's no comment. And so you know, if we're trying to determine, for instance, if there's adequate sewer capacity in an area, we need to know that. And so that is something that we will need to chase those people if we have to in those other departments. But part of this process is really to make sure that they've got the tools they need to fit into our process and timelines.
Okay, and I don't mean to suggest that other departments wouldn't be as concerned or work with urgency, but the financial penalty is on planning services, right? It's not on any other department. So obviously there's a direct accountability there. So I think something we should watch, and please make council aware if there's ongoing issues. I guess the other would be external agencies, for example, provincial agencies like the MTO. How would delays from external agencies affect our timelines and any of the provincial requirements?
I'll allow Emily to build on this, but we are tightening up our timelines for those consultations. I think the provincial agencies are well aware of the drivers for that and answer to political masters that have signed on to this process and timelines according to that. We will have to continue to work with our colleagues in those agencies and other levels of government. But I think our requirements are clear. And if it's something that is simple, we will be moving on. If it's something that's critical or, that is of a very significant impact to human health or the environment, in those cases, we'll have to escalate within those agencies in order to ensure we get an answer. But if it's simply a non-response from one of our circulation parties that is likely to have little impact, we will be moving on in those cases. Yeah, and Emily can build on that.
If I may also just build on that through the chair. In instances where there are critical comments that do come in late, the two tools under the Planning Act that we can use in a zoning bylaw sense are to place a hold on the zoning, where we can condition whatever is outstanding to be resolved at a later time. Similarly, with site plan controls, we can also condition whatever is outstanding at the end. So if comments do come in through critical agencies at a later time, we do have tools in order to recognize and deal with those at a later time.
Okay, that's good to hear. On the dispute resolution, just quickly, are there any similar ombudsman or referee type of roles for other municipal departments, whether it's planning or otherwise, that you can think of that might be a model that would work here?
Not that I can think of on the spot, Mr. Chair, regrettably. I wish I had some that I could pull out of a hat, but it's something that we're prepared to look at and look for examples in our own organization, but in other organizations as well, to come up with something that is, balanced and straightforward.
Okay. I had a question about the process of canceling or rescheduling planning committee meetings or council meetings. And there was a line in the proposed amendments to the procedure bylaw that said when the canceling or rescheduling would result in the city incurring a cost as a result of expiry of the statutory timeline, the meeting may only be canceled or rescheduled with written approval of the whole of council. What does that actually mean? How would that work from a practical point of view?
Mr. Chair, we would anticipate that that could occur in one of two ways. One would be via a resolution adopted at a council meeting. The other would be via a written petition or circulation similar to the convening of a special meeting. We do anticipate we would know in advance whether there are applications for a given meeting, and so it would only be under extraordinary circumstances where that process would have to be undertaken. Mr. Chair, I'll add, we have left in the procedure bylaw the opportunity for, under emergency circumstances, for a meeting to be canceled should they occur.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. I think my last question was just overall on the methodology that staff use to identify and recommend these changes of process. Is it correct this was an internal exercise, an internal team that was focused on this?
It was both internal and external. As Emily indicated, she's been actively engaged with other municipalities across the province that are essentially building a similar process.
Okay, and was there any kind of change management methodology like a lean or otherwise to help inform some of the reviews?
Yes, there was.
Okay, good, thank you. As I said earlier, like I think a lot of this is new process, so there's a lot of change, and I think maybe a year from now isn't reasonable that we could have a good sense of what is working or what isn't, but I imagine this will be many iterations of improvement over the next few years. And I'll end by saying thank you to staff. It's a big project, a big exercise to review and change these processes, and you've done it while the requirements from the province continue to change. So you've done change management while the rules keep changing, and would not surprise me if a few weeks or a couple months from now, there's even more that gets thrown at us. So thank you for putting this in front of us today. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. I first want to begin by saying I'm generally supportive of what the province is trying to accomplish. I do believe that average timelines to fulfill these applications are too long, and I believe we need to strike a happy medium, and it might be that after a year and so of reporting back to various councils that some tweaks may have to happen, but generally I'm supportive of what the intention is. I do want to ask Mr. Herwire if he's aware if the city's Auditor General has ever audited the planning process, the steps we take, the timelines, the resources. Has that ever been done?
Looking around the table, Councillor, not to my knowledge, no, that hasn't been the subject of a review.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you. Question was raised about cost recovery, given that the city has to absorb costs for adding new staff and resources in particular. And I know that provincially we've been focusing on the revenue loss from some of the DCs that are being waived through some other legislation. But I'm not aware of municipalities asking for costs to be recovered through this particular legislation. Can staff just comment if either the city of Ottawa or others have been asking for resources because of new staff that have to be hired to meet these new timelines?
Chair, not through Bill 109 specifically, but in previous housing bills, there was, and through provincial announcements, there has been fundings to support streamlining of process.
Okay.
And so we have taken advantage of that with, hiring some staff that has supported some staff and co-op students in order to work through some backlog.
So sorry, in relation to Bill 109, we have not?
That is correct.
Okay.
It's previous to Bill 109.
Okay. I really need clarification on this 3-week pre-consult timeline, because after that 3 weeks, my understanding is it would be the actual formal application of that file, correct? And when that happens, no changes can be made to that application. Is that correct?
During that 3 weeks, staff will review the studies and plans to ensure that they're consistent, that they're adequate, and that they meet the terms of reference. If they are adequate, then the applicant will be given an opportunity to formally apply. And that process, the official review process, will start. Through the process, we no longer have the time to do revisions the way we have in the past. You know, as a good chunk of that 196 days has been the back and forth to get to yes. So we now have 60 or 90 days to deal with that application. And so that the luxury of working towards yes is no longer available to us. So we have an ability. We don't have ability to go through multiple revisions. We do have an ability to approve, as I mentioned earlier, approve it as it was submitted, refuse it, and these are for zonings, approve it as it was submitted, refuse it, approve it with a holding provision, or approve it with modifications.
And do you envision that most will be approve it with modifications?
I think we're going to have a mix. And I think if we look at zoning in its purest sense, and I know a lot of the times we come to committee with zonings, some of those discussions are about site plan related matters. And those are often the issues that are of concern to the community. I think when we're dealing with the building, height and massing, there will be situations where we have changes that we are going to recommend. There will be situations where we've got holding provisions. We will have some refusals, more refusals than we have in the past. If I think of my time in planning, I can think of like 3 refusal reports that we've brought forward because we do typically work to yes.
So the reason I'm asking this is I'm trying to figure out when we insert true community or public consultation. You want to do it before the application has been formally submitted, because if legitimate constructive feedback is received from the public that directly applies to the application that should be implemented, some developers do take the time to in good faith listen and make changes. And I can cite cases in my ward where that actually does happen. My understanding is they will not be able to do that at that point once the application has been formally submitted.
They will still be able to reach out and inform their community, but the opportunity to have the back and forth is lost. We will be encouraging, as regardless of the recommendations and directions that are before us today, which staff are comfortable with and support with respect to including counselors or community groups in pre-consultation. We will, as we do today, encourage applicants, outside of those recommendations, to communicate and start consultations with their community and the ward counselors. Like we do that on an informal basis today, and we will continue to do that because we appreciate that the early involvement from ward counselors and the public ultimately results in better applications.
It is possible that I would become aware of a development application only when it's been formally submitted. Is that correct?
Yes, as it is today.
Right. So it's possible that the clock starts ticking on an application that cannot be amended even before I'm aware of it, and engage my community on making them aware of what the development application is and how they can get involved. So I'm very concerned that this process may be setting up the public who have expectations right now, which are at times challenging to meet, which may ultimately remove them from a process where their feedback can be used to modify an application, because it'll already be too late. So even if motions pass that say, hey, we want a better engagement with community associations, okay, fine, that's better than nothing. But the average Joe who lives beside a development or proposed development needs to be engaged as well. The public as a whole needs to be included in this process. So I'm very concerned about that 3-week pre-consult process, because again, the legislated requirement for a public meeting is here. There's no requirement to have a public meeting. In the community, to engage the community. That's really where counselors pick up the slack and move files forward by engaging. So I just want to raise this as a very real concerns that I have in that regard. On the matter of reporting out, I do appreciate the 1 year, and I just wanted to get staff's reaction to a suggestion I have, and that is that planning and ARAC receive a verbal update from staff in January of 2024, which is basically the 6-month mark. Not a formal requirement for a written report, but basically give us a brief presentation on how things are going, the functionality of the new process, how our timelines being met. I'd like to know if there's any emergencies sooner rather than later. If it's simply an assurance that counselor, yeah, there've been some challenges, but staffing is good, and we're basically able to provide the level of service that the applicants need. That's the type of an update I'd like to have at the 6-month mark. So I'd like to ask staff if that's possible, and if they agree, then Chair, I'd like to move that as a direction. Can we get a 6-month verbal update?
Staff are not opposed to keeping counselors in the loop. I think ultimately it's up to the chairs to determine whether they would want that type of report at their committee. I mean, if it's outside of a formal report, I don't have a process to feed it in, but certainly happy to work with the chairs if that's something that they would like to have at their committees.
So Chair, I'm just looking to you, and
well, are you taking that will you take that as direction?
Happy to.
Okay.
Is that satisfactory to you,
Yeah,
Councillor?
thank you.
Thanks.
Finally, if on the day after the time period to have an application heard passes, is a refund automatic, or does the applicant need to apply for a refund?
Mr. Chair, one can require that the applicant apply for a refund, but the legislation is absolutely clear. There is no discretion.
So we will monitor the timelines of every application, and for every application that is past that timeline, we'll have to obviously monitor whether it's, I'm just making these numbers up, the first 25 days is a certain refund, and then there's a tiered approach, but staff will have to monitor every single application, whether it met the timelines or not. And the answer to this question is refunds will be automatic.
Mr. Chair, as I said, one can require that the refund request be made as part of the process, but that request having been made, there is zero discretion on the part of the municipality. And the example that I've given several times to bring home the difference is members of committee may be aware that for heritage applications, there is also a 90-day time period, but the legislation specifically allows for an extension to that 90-day, several extensions to that 90-day period upon agreement between the city and the applicant. There is no such provision with respect to the fee refunds in the Planning Act.
Thank you. My last question is,
sorry, Councillor, it's been, I think, several minutes worth of questioning at this point. Can I ask you to go back on the list?
Absolutely. No
Thank
problem.
you.
Thanks.
Councillor Troster.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to city staff for sitting through our extensive questions, because obviously, this legislation was thrown at us just like it was thrown at you. So I do appreciate your fulsome explanation. I have a question in regard to landmark buildings. So folks who don't know, landmark buildings are generally very tall buildings that have to have very distinct architecture, and they're often the tallest building of its kind in a given neighborhood. And we have quite a few of them in Somerset Ward. And generally in exchange for extra height in a heritage area, for example, they're expected to provide civic uses and green space. And these things are defined very broadly, which means that they're subject to really extensive consultation with community. So given that these timelines are provincially mandated and we can't change them, how is this new process going to impact landmark buildings? I'm assuming it means the pre-consult phase could be years long. Am I correct?
Through the chair, and thank you for the question. Landmark buildings are typically defined, I believe, in the Centertown secondary plan, as well as there might be also discussion in the Westboro or Wellington West secondary plan. So they're not by any means throughout the city. They're in specific areas, and where those landmark building policy provisions are in place, you're right, they can take years worth of public consultation, and typically that will now be occurring during pre-consultation phases. Right now, and we did have this question with the industry when we met with them to brief them on the report last week. Right now, those consultations are typically taking place before an application is actually submitted. So we do see that continuing and to occur in this new process during pre-con.
Okay, so it'll be much the same because yeah, we're obviously consulting a lot before they even file the application. Is there any ability for applicants to waive the right to a refund as a gesture of good faith, or is it they get it no matter what?
Mr. Chair, there is not.
Just wanted to clarify. Thank you. I mean, I'm really thankful for the motions from my colleagues to try to really build consultation into this process, even though it's not prescribed, because it really is important. And what I like to tell developers when they come to me is, you're going to have a better result if you work with a community. And the alternative to a community meeting is to have 25 people come to planning committee when you're applying for a zoning amendment and to speak against your building. There's going to be growing pains as we intensify, and we really need the community on board. And I've seen so many examples where that community involvement in the pre-consultation period has made for a better result. So I really hope that developers work with us on that, because that community buy-in is super important, especially when it comes to something like a landmark building. I just have a question on 3.2. So if I'm not mistaken, heritage staff is only adding one more staffer to deal with this backlog of having to approve heritage or designate heritage properties. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Court Curry's here and coming up to answer the question.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Councillor. We're adding 4 more staff through this initiative. Yeah.
Okay. And given that there's currently a 2-year backlog, do you feel this is sufficient to fill the backlog before we risk properties being removed from the registry?
Yes, Councillor, through the chair, we are bringing forward a Bill 23 compliance report to the next Build Heritage Committee in June, which will detail our branch's work plan, and we have proposed resourcing to match that work plan.
Okay, that's great. And I just want to say I support the plan to staff up both in planning and heritage department. There's absolutely no way we can meet the timelines otherwise. And as a city, we obviously can't afford to forgo these application fees. So thank you very much to staff for proposing a process that does the best we can with a really tough situation. And I really do hope that it leads to quicker approvals. But I also really do share the concerns about lack of community consultation. Some weeks I have 3 or 4 development application consultations in my ward because of the pace of development. But I will say that because our community associations have signed on to the pre-consultation process, and we've been able to negotiate with most developers to do that consultation early, I'm not sure in my community that this will change things too much on our end, but it also means we would really appreciate, as much information possible about planning staff. If you know that someone is in the pre-consultation phase, if there's something coming down the pike, so we can note it to contact those builders and, start working on the outreach as soon as possible, because I foresee a lot of legitimate community pushback if neighbors and community associations are not given the chance to be involved. Thank you.
Well said, Councillor Foster. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you very much, Chair. So there's been a lot of great conversation about the pre-consultation and involvement of community already around the table, which is tremendous. So I'd like to focus on just unpacking a little bit what once the application is deemed complete and the clock starts. I've had some good conversations with staff leading up to today, but I think it would be helpful to understand from the community's perspective, as people have said, community members may not know to pay attention until that placard goes up, right? That's really the sort of like, holy smoke, something's happening. So I'd like to be able to unpack here what community comments do after the placard goes up. So if you could help walk us through, if a community member sees that sign go up and wants to make a comment, where their comments go and what difference those comments can make during that shortened window.
The public comments that come in on an application, you know, they're generally looked at differently if they're a zoning or a site plan. And to be, you know, frank, the majority of comments we get relate to site plan, even if it's a zoning application. And so, you know, those comments, you know, do go to the planner that's responsible for their file. And, you know, there's sometimes things that, you know, that are raised that are, you know, local community knowledge that may not be represented in the plans and studies. And if that's, you know, for instance, there's a drainage easement or there's a, you know, some sort of historic, you know, feature on this site that takes the drainage for the whole area, right? And we have some weird drainage situations in your ward that sometimes come up, that something was done in the 20s or, you know, with respect to piping things and nobody knew it was there, but there's somebody in the community that knows that, and it may not be reflected on the plans. And in those cases, it's you know, that's critical information for how the file is going to ultimately develop and how they're going to have to accommodate those impacts. You know, if it's questions about, you know, parking or access to the street, it may influence where, you know, where the access or exit to a site is. You know, certainly questions around garbage location may influence where it goes, tree plantings, things of that nature. You know, zonings are a little bit more difficult. You know, the comments we often hear on zonings are, particularly in an urban context, you know, are related to height and massing. And sometimes those can impact, you know, the way the building is shaped or formed, which is one of the reasons why we've got zoning coming forward before site plan, right? So if we have a concern about a building that comes up because of a sensitive neighbor, or there's a rationale that there is a sound rationale, you know, a community member has raised that there's impacts of that building that, you know, we are now aware of that can influence the form and function of the building with a step back or a setback at the second or fourth story or things like that that can alter the shape of the building. You know, certainly those comments are considered. Staff don't always agree with the comments or you know, come to the same conclusion that the resident may have, but their comments, you know, often do result in a better development or a development that's more sensitive to the surroundings.
Okay, thank you. So comments that are received once the clock has started ticking there's still a process to receive them, and they can still impact the decision on the file. If there is a decision from the planning staff that, like, I appreciate they're saying now we're not going to work towards yes in the same way, but from what I understand from the report, you have changed the mechanism for an applicant to withdraw and to start a new application in the case of perhaps a no decision, right? So in my mind, there is still an opportunity for comments from the public to inform whether planning staff will accept or reject an application. That information would be helpful to an applicant to know. Like, I assume an applicant would not like to go to committee with a report that says no. Then the onus is on that applicant then to make a decision. Are you going to roll the dice here at committee with a report that doesn't recommend pursuing the development, or are you going to withdraw and create a new application? Is this not also a mechanism whereby community members can be assuaged that there is some existing consistent mechanism for those comments to have an impact? I appreciate your discretion, though, in saying that you get a lot of comments that aren't actually relevant to the question in front of them. And that is certainly the education and training, et cetera, that isn't part of my motion elsewhere. But I just want to confirm that once the placard, because otherwise we don't put the placard up, right? So we're putting that signage up to do what, and what kind of impacts can it have? Can you just comment on the withdrawal and resubmit, or not resubmission, the withdrawal and new application piece, please?
Sure. So, Chair, I'll ask Emily to speak to the process with respect to withdrawal and submission.
Through the chair, and thank you for the question. That is the exact reason why that tool is before you as part of the fee bylaw amendment. Just so that during the comment period for both site plan controls and zoning bylaw amendments, if the department is in a position for refusal of a zoning bylaw amendment, for example, or unfavorable conditions for a site plan control, as an example, the applicant does have a tool to withdraw their application and submit a new file for a reduced fee. We have mirrored the fee from what exists today for a resubmission. So in today's process, an applicant can take feedback through the community consultation sessions or through the ability to comment during circulation and do a resubmission, and they have to pay a fee today. I think it's upwards of $4,000. So we're mirroring that same process that exists today, but through a withdrawal process and then submitting a new file so that they can adjust their application based on the comments received from communities, from councillors, and from stakeholders.
Thank you for that. So I do think that's an important dimension to what's being put forward in front of us, that there is still a mechanism whereby those participants that engage when that placard goes up have an opportunity to offer meaningful feedback. I think that we can see that there's an expectation of a tune-up, not just for city staff here, but also for the public and also for the councillors, right? So we all are also going to have to be paying a much more closer attention. We're going to have to be able to deploy, a community consultation in a much shorter amount of time. Those templates, I'm sure, Charmaine, is what you're trying to address by that. So in the sense of what, Councillor Brockington put forward to say that we could be in a lose-lose-lose, which I'm sure is very soundbiteable and lovely. I would also hope that we're going to aim towards a win-win-win, whereby we create the appropriate investments in public participation, in city staff, but then also within our own teams, our own hiring, and our own engagement processes within the councillor's office to get this right, because the stakes are high. As Councillor Brockington says, but again, with the intention of Bill 109, I think that they are trying to get more homes built faster. And we all have a role here. So thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Johnson. We're making Elisa's job easy this afternoon. Councillor Luloff.
Thanks. It seems to me that the Bill 109 was supposed to present an opportunity for us to make decisions quicker without a markedly increased cost, which will in turn allow for faster building, more housing stock, and lower housing prices due to the increased supply, shorter timelines, and less time consuming and costly red tape during the process. So the province is attempting to make approval easier by removing what they've deemed to be superfluous process. But it seems that, through some of this, we're doing the opposite, probably in equal measure in what seems to be a cheeky attempt to maintain the status quo as much as possible. It looks like we're adding more front-end review and more staff and more costs in the front end. And I can imagine that the municipal affairs and housing minister will be upset with a 17.5% increase in fees. Are you concerned that this fee increase is going to raise the building cost of building new homes in Ottawa?
Mr. Chair, while I appreciate it may be counterintuitive, I think that the potential to reduce the timelines will actually increase affordability. And the rationale for that is that, we are conscious that time is money and that delays in our process result in delays in them bringing product to market. And if I use a quick, back of the napkin example, and I appreciate the industry may want to poke holes at this, but, the carrying cost on a $10 million project, which is by no means a large project, is about $1,500 a day. And so if we can shave off through this process a week, the additional application fees that we're resulting in through our fee increase will be more than offset. And so as those projects get larger, the benefits of moving them through the process faster becomes significantly greater.
Thank you for that. With the proposed changes, are we not shifting the inefficiencies of the process to the front end?
Through the chair, and thank you for the question. I think it's important to recognize that the Planning Act has a tool in it to allow municipalities to create a pre-consultation process. So the fact that the City of Ottawa has one is only because the province has afforded us the ability to have one. We at the City of Ottawa are very lucky that we put in place a pre-consultation process back in 2009. And we had the ability to then, through through the province instituting Bill 109, to analyze how that has been working. So it's been in the works, the pre-consultation process, for about 10 years. And so through the last year, we've analyzed how it's been working and ways to improve. And the ways to improve and streamline application processing once it comes into official review is by having that dialogue at the beginning and ensuring that applications are in good standing when they are submitted. So by putting in place that phased pre-consultation process does add a little bit more time at the beginning, but provided applicants work with the city, I do truly believe that it will allow for a faster application processing through official review.
If I can add to that, Chair, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it is not one thing that will ultimately bring us to a successful outcome in a Bill 109 world. We are looking at the team approach, which, if we look at our system today and where we see some delays, one of the things that could be attributed to delays is multiple submissions and review. And if we look at our first round comments, and I've looked at some of our first round comments, it is not uncommon in those first round comments to say, to have staff identifying for the applicants that there are consistency issues within the plans and studies that they've submitted. For instance, a landscape architect that may submit a landscape plan that doesn't quite jive with, a grading and drainage plan or whatnot, where you've got different disciplines on the applicant side that may not have communicated, perfectly on a project. And part of our review process is to ensure that when we get the application, that they've addressed those concerns that we've identified, that they are consistent and that they meet the terms of reference, so that hopefully those first round comments won't be identifying things, or when we get that official package, we won't have issues with consistency or not addressing issues that we identified at pre-consult. That's part of it. The other part of it is when we look at our applications, it is not uncommon for a staff person throughout the process to step away from their desk, whether that's medical leave, whether that's a variety of leaves type, including vacation. And when they step away today, their application sits. We do have cover off to deal with that files if something critical arises while that file lead is away. But those cover offs have their own workload and own projects that they need to continue to move forward. And they're not typically as engaged in the file as the file lead. And by implementing the team approach, our hope is that those files, unless everybody goes off at the same time, that those files will have somebody that's engaged in them, that knows what the next step in the process is, and can continue to move that along the conveyor belt.
I appreciate you raising that. I consistently hear that the City of Ottawa is one of the most difficult municipal jurisdictions to build in because of these inconsistencies and because of the amount of red tape that people have to go through to build. So I appreciate you raising that. We hear also about the inconsistencies in approaches from different planners, which I suppose makes sense. I mean, given that these are human beings with bias and habit and whatnot, and I'm glad to hear that there'll be better cover off. I've had files sit for 4 months without the applicant even knowing why it's not moving because a planner decided to take a vacation and didn't tell anybody about it. So this is good, but are you concerned that having more hands on a single file will slow things down?
Today, when we transfer a file from one person to another, for instance, if somebody goes on sick leave and somebody else has to step in and take over ownership and carriage of that file, there is nothing worse for a timeline than that happen, right? A fresh set of eyes, in my opinion, is very different than having more hands on deck. And I, my experience has been, if we can avoid bringing in somebody new midway through a process to regurgitate concerns or issues that have already been addressed or identified early on in the process, that's something we need to try to avoid. Having people engaged in the file with identified tasks and responsibilities, including a senior staff person who has the experience and understanding of our policies to be able to make decisions, in my opinion, I think will work. I hope it will work. And I guess ultimately the proof will be in the pudding when we come back to council to report on time.
Thank you for that. Looking at that list of studies, it's a pretty daunting list, and I understand that not every application is going to require that entire list of 40 something studies. But I may suggest that it may make sense to reconsider whether or not we require the urban design review panel for zoning, for instance, energy modeling and community energy plans until the HPDS is in place, because right now it's not. The streetscape character analysis, if we're actually serious about our official plan, and the urban design brief. Do you want to comment on that?
The studies that are related to the HPDS are on the list, and they've been on the list. We aren't currently requiring them at this point in time, and that will become an implementation as HPDS returns back to committee and council for approval. One of the things that I think is part of that discussion, and David Wise is at the table and may want to elaborate on that, is the ability to ensure that those studies are required at the right stage in the process, so that we're, whether they may be implemented as a condition of site plan, or whether it's something that comes in early on in a zoning. That's a discussion that I think will flesh out through the HPDS discussion. The list is long. No application will have all of them. It's just not a typical application, and I encourage any one of you or any member of the public or council to look at the DevApps page and look at files that you're familiar with in your ward and the studies that have been asked for as part of that application. And those are the ones we're asking for. And that is, if there are studies on there that members of council feel are superfluous and not needed in a particular situation, I'm more than happy to have a discussion about that. But ultimately what drives those triggers or the requirements for those studies, our official plan policies, depending on where a site is and whether it's, for instance, is it near a provincially significant wetland, or is it in a rural area where we've got groundwater concerns that we may not have the same concerns if we were in a downtown. The length of the list of the studies is not the driver of the amount of work associated to a file. It's what the official plan policies are, where the site is located, and what the issues and concerns that need to be addressed are. I don't know if you want to add to that, but that's ultimately what drives those studies, whether they're required. We are looking to, I think the speaker earlier spoke to, it would be nice to have clarity as to what types of files will identify those. That is something staff is working on, is to provide sort of a matrix as to what triggers which files and what types of applications should expect to see some of those study requests, so that there's certainty and awareness before we even start the pre-consultation process for applicants. I think that is a good suggestion, and we agree with that and are already working on it. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I think that one thing that has also been quite frustrating is you'll have a study that's required of one applicant when a very similar that covers a larger area around a site plan, right? That has been required in the past, like within the last 5 years, by another builder adjacent to that property. And then this builder has to do the exact same study and come up with the exact same results, which is adding cost. Is there any way or any provision that we can have that if a study has been done in a neighborhood that, that affects the exact same property or the exact same area, that not be required over and over and over again in the same area? And not to diminish the fact that, safety is incredibly important, but things like seismic study is going to be the same, if you're within, for the most part, as long as the conditions are the same in the same area. Obviously if there's changes, in that area, or differences in soil stability or differences in soil, of course you would require that. But if it's sitting on the same area, like sitting on the same bedrock or sitting on the same soil conditions, why would we require that study to be done over and over and over again?
Through the chair, and thank you for the question. The terms of references for each study, or sometimes their guidelines, is where the triggers are outlined for when a study is required and why. Those terms of references or guidelines have discretion built within them. So if there are instances where a study was recently submitted and the parameters are the same, there could be a discussion between the applicant and the planning department in order to determine if that study should be waived in those unique circumstances. So that is built into those terms of references and guidelines.
So that is happening now, correct?
Those discussions can continue to happen, yes, during pre-consultation.
Okay, great. And do we keep track
Sorry,
of this?
Councillor Lopez, can I ask you to go back on the list, and your colleague, Councillor Kitts, has been waiting for a while.
Sure, unless you don't mind if I finish, is that okay?
No, okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that that's happening now. Is there some sort of repository of these studies where it's, where you can see on a map, what's been done already, so that somebody can go in and say like, okay, well, maybe I won't have to do this, or?
Through the chair, DevApps is where all of the studies are listed. So yes, you can see by ward, for example, what applications are within that ward. And then you can click on each one of those and see the studies that come up that were submitted in support of that application.
But not an aggregate, right? You'd have to go through each and every single one.
Correct.
Okay, great. Do external agencies need to comment within a period of time now? So like Enbridge, Hydro, and Fire Safety, has that been worked into this? Are they going to have to be under the same sort of timeline restrictions as everyone else?
That is correct.
Okay, great. And that consultation work has been done, and they're going to be able to meet those timelines?
Through the chair, yes, we have consulted with the external stakeholders and technical agencies to ensure that they're aware of these new provincially mandated timelines and the real big crunch that's going to be municipalities to process those applications.
Okay, I promise I only have 2 more questions, Mr. Chair. Can we ensure that Bill 109 is not using up staff required to complete the comprehensive rezoning exercise? So this work is desperately needed and will drastically reduce the cost of building, reduce the draw on staff resources, and increase density, once it's complete. So is it the same pool of resources that is being used to do both of these projects?
Mr. Chair, the development applications are reviewed by staff and planning services. The comprehensive zoning bylaw update is being led through policy and UD, whatever David's acronym is, UDLRP, EDLRP.
EDLRP.
So that the staff, the positions are different. When we post for positions, there is often a cross application, and I cannot guarantee that there will not be somebody within a policy branch that might not apply to an application or a position within development services, and vice versa. We often do see staff moving back and forth between the 2 service areas.
Okay, last one, I promise. I'm pleased to see Vice Chair Gower's motion on a reserve. Though I may personally feel that a reduction in fees would be a better approach to reducing the cost of housing at the front end. But over the course of the last 5 years or so, the city has accumulated a surplus of about $10 million when it comes to these fees. And I understand that a lot of these fees pay for staff time and whatnot, but this is a surplus. Where has that money gone before this reserve, if it is to come into place? Where has that money gone?
So respectfully, Chair, I think that there's a disagreement in the numbers that have been presented by GOBA in the Altus report, and whether or not they reflect the budget that's also, attributed to the agricultural affairs through the development review staff. I'll draw your attention for your own satisfaction to the budget. I think it's page 47 is agricultural affairs and 235 is the planning and housing, and compare those with the study that was provided by Altus. I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions, but I will leave it that staff do not agree with the numbers that have been provided by GOBA, and that the statement that we're currently projecting a surplus for 2023 is categorically not the case.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your graciousness, my friend. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Kitts, and then we're going to Councillor Duros.
Great. Thank you, Chair. No problem. I did think of one more question after I spoke earlier. So we're no longer going to have city-led consultation meetings on site plan control. Councillors will be able to lead their own meetings should they choose. Will staff attend if requested? And the reason I'm asking this out loud is because I think we all need to understand the capacity of staff and respect it. So if we are holding information meetings, I think it'll be good to know if are we on our own or can we expect staff support?
Staff are facing a considerable, resource constraint, and the current approach is that staff would not be participating in public consultations except in exceptional circumstances. So those public meetings that counselors may be looking to lead, we'd encourage you to bring out the applicants. But at this point in time, staff are not proposing to continue that process of participating in those discussions.
You want me to ask about zoning too? What about on zoning? Same.
Without repeating myself, it's essentially the same answer.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Like I said, I think it's important for us to all know that as we make our own plans. And so I'll just co-sign Councillor Troster's comments. I know, I'm sure there's a lot of developers and their consultants listening. I really do hope they continue to work with councillors in their communities. I think there are a lot of councillors around this table who want to work with you in a constructive way and bring that local context to the applications to make them better. I can think of countless examples, my own experience where we've made good changes that have improved an application. And I think we want to build housing, but we also want to build healthy communities. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kipps. Well said. Councillor DeRoche.
Thanks very much, Chair. One of my biggest worries for this process is that I'm pretty confident that we're going to work very hard to accelerate the housing growth throughout the city. I think my residents would say we're already doing a pretty good job to see very rapid growth in a lot of the suburban communities in the south and east and the west. And with that comes the expectation that we build complete communities that has the services in them. And it's not just house after house after house. We need to have healthy neighborhoods that includes the infrastructure and services. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on us as a city, I think, to keep up with that housing growth. And that includes also processing the school applications. And I appreciate, Dawn, that you gave me an update this week that first public high school for Riverside South has moved through the planning process. Second public school that's urgently needed in Finley Creek has moved through our planning process. And my question to staff is, what are we going to do to make sure that projects like schools, which are not novel infrastructure, right? The school boards are very bright in that they recycle their school plans. These are not new development, the new projects that are coming to the table. So what are we going to do to ensure that the schools are going to get the proper attention they need, and we're going to turn around as quickly as possible and not have multiple circulations for a project again that I think we've seen time after time, and we should be able to get it right as long as again the servicing is there and kind of the showstoppers are addressed. Some of the other items, while worthy of discussion, certainly shouldn't get in the way of opening the doors for schools to serve the growing communities. Thanks.
Thank you for the question, Chair. And yes, certainly happy to confirm we're in good shape on those two schools and the funding announcements. So, the city has a good relationship with the school boards. We communicate well. There is some level of duplication, that can be applied. Of course, every site is somewhat different. In terms of the timelines, they're subject to their own funding, provincial funding regime. So we're very sensitive to that and certainly prioritize those applications when they do come in, given those funding constraints, and quite often a lag time in the community to get those needed schools. So we're very aware of that and respond in terms of our priority approach.
That's what I want to hear, and I appreciate that the conversation with the provinces in terms of how they fund them and move them. But once it's in our court, the ball's in our court, that's when I'm glad to hear we're going to make it a priority. And it's, again, these are not novel projects that, especially in a greenfield area, again, where the services are there. I'm hopeful that we'll turn it around quickly. Thank you. That's all, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to thank Councillor Kitts for your questions. And frankly, Derek, I'm really shocked to hear that staff will not be able to attend consultation meetings anymore. We often run them through my office, which is still a tremendous amount of work for my staff. But having city planners there is really crucial to helping the community understand these developments. So my question to you is, are you saying staff cannot participate in these consultations anymore, or that they may not, workload depending?
I think it will be the exception rather than the rule, right? And I think the presentation highlighted that the public meeting, the requirement for a public meeting is planning and housing committee or agriculture and rural affairs. And with respect to that, you know, the timelines that we're under within the new process and the opportunities to amend that process are limited, or to amend those applications are limited. And we're ultimately facing those 4 choices that I outlined. So there will be exceptions to that rule where there's a particularly controversial file where, we are, happy to support councillors, but as a general rule, if it's a fairly straightforward application, it is unlikely that staff will be supporting those meetings.
Okay. Would staff be able to support those meetings if they are outside of the application period, if they are in an earlier pre-consultation phase?
The resourcing that we have outlined today, and maybe it's a discussion that, we may be able to give you a different answer as we get ourselves into this. And if we are successful in meeting these timelines and looking to, achieve the process as it is, that we can then maybe start to reintroduce it as we come back to report. But at this point in time, I'm very concerned about, we are adding new staff, but I'm still very concerned about the resources we have and the timelines we have to adjust to, combined with all of the change management we're working through. And, while I'm open to having a discussion about it in the future, and certainly I serve at the will of council, I am very concerned about the resources we have today, and diverting staff to public consultation takes them away from processing files.
Okay, understood. My question to you is, do you have a sense of what additional resources you would need to allow staff to be able to participate in public consultation? I could put that as an inquiry to have you come back with, but I'm deeply concerned now about how these processes remove public consultation as it is. And if we choose to initiate it on our own as councillors in the early phase, to not have city staff support is extremely problematic. It will severely curtail citizens' ability to understand these developments. I think it's going to lead to a lot more opposition at planning committee. I know we're all trying to make this work within what may seem like unreasonable timelines, but I just want to underline that not having staff support at those meetings is a huge problem. And I would be open to hearing what resources you think you might need to make that happen and to bring that back to this committee for consideration.
Sure. And I appreciate this committee doesn't meet very often, but I'm happy to report back to both committees if that's,
that would be very helpful, because if it's a matter of maybe you have somebody who's an outreach staff person who attends these consultations and helps explain processes. Like if this means another staff person to make sure that we can get community consultation right, I think that's something we should talk about at this committee, because it's not just adapting to these new processes, it's bringing the community on board with us. And even though this legislation was imposed on us, this is a fundamental shift in citizens' ability to be involved in the way that their community is developing. So I really appreciate the constraints you're under, but I would really, really appreciate it if you could. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a planner, because I know planners, there's going to be a hot market for them and it'll be hard to hire them. But if there's a way that we can find someone or have some people share as part of their job description to be involved in at least some community consultations, I think that would be an enormous relief, because, we talked about this as part of our governance review. We're not we can't pay our staff in councillor's office nearly what we should for the kind of work that they do. And this work is going to get placed on the shoulders of already overworked councillor's office staff. And I mean, it puts us all in a really tough position.
Chair, I appreciate what the councillor is looking for, and I do also appreciate the clarification on your expectation of whether that's that planner or not, or the planner or not. And I think that's something we can take away. And
okay. That would be great. I'm open to creative solutions. Maybe there's an outreach position that's created, or someone who's good at giving plain language explanations of city processes. But I do think if it's just a councillor and a developer in a community consultation. I think it also might unnecessarily politicize some of these consultations. I find city staff are very good at grounding these consultations in what's possible, what's not possible, explaining processes. And I think that's really, really key to citizen understanding and engagement. So thank you very much for taking that back.
Councillor Dudas?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I really want to make sure there's no confusion on my part or the community's part in regards to the weight given to public consultation or councillor consultation. My understanding of Bill 109 and just the various legislation pieces that the province has put before us, has forced upon us, means that we can say, we can share our concerns, we can advocate, we can express them to city staff, but at the end of the day, within the timelines that you're now required to meet, within the legislative requirements you're now required to meet, my understanding is that consultation will not have that much weight. And I'm trying to get through any confusion that the community might have. We're basically being told we'll be informed of various applications, we'll be informed of developments, and we may have some ability to share local concerns, local application impacts on the community, but we will not be able, under the provincial legislation, to have major influence. Am I mistaken on this? Like, as you can probably tell, I'm quite furious about these provincial changes, but I really want the community and my colleagues on council to understand, do we have influence? Does the community have influence?
Through the chair, and thank you for the question. Community consultation through councillor-led information sessions, through technical circulation, or through comments through to committee and council still have weight. They will continue to have weight and influence the decisions. What the change that may be becoming for you is that zoning bylaw amendments will no longer be working towards a yes. You will have more refusals of zoning bylaw amendments before you, and you will have more zoning bylaw amendments with hold provisions to continue to work through issues. Regarding site plan controls, they will have more conditions to work out if there are issues brought up during those consultation sessions. Those are the tools that we have under the Planning Act in order to continue to resolve outstanding concerns with those two types of applications.
I appreciate that, because I get the sense that what will happen is we as councillors will continue to advocate. City staff will be listening. They will try to take into account the community's concerns. Developers hopefully will be in these meetings or listening to local concerns. But at the end of the day, these approvals will be made and it'll go through, and we're going to see more density. We're going to see more of what the province is asking us to see. So I really do want to emphasize that, when it comes to education for ourselves, but also the community on what this now means, I don't want people thinking that, community consultations will have the same kind of weight as maybe they once had for some of these. And I do appreciate you sharing that. I will just quickly say to the motion that I'm bringing forward, one of the things that strikes me is we know our communities incredibly well. We know them from the emails we get about complaints about people parking on the street, or issues with, school in drop-off periods and the traffic that creates, or maybe there's a pathway that's hasn't been redone in 50 years. And we know that this development will have an impact on it. Like, we know them very well. The reason why I wanted to bring forward this motion was so that even at the earliest stages, we would have some ability to share those local concerns, that we could try to express them at the earliest stages so they can be incorporated into the process. I don't know what that will look like, and I've asked staff to come back with what that might look like under the time frame they're working with. So I will ask for people's support on my motion, but it's really to try to have that ability to share our insights, our experience on behalf of the residents and the people that we serve at that earliest stage. So I will be asking for my colleagues' support on that motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Dudas, thank you. Are there any further questions for staff? I don't see any. I've been knocking the questions off my own list as those have been answered. So I only have one, and I'll be the one who poses it, I guess, because I know it's not good optics, but if you sit on planning committee, you now have, if I'm correct, a scheduled meeting between council and planning committee every week of the year without break. Is that accurate? Sorry, and I should say, I do understand that some of the summer meetings will be special meetings, but there is never going to be a week in which we don't have planning approvals in front of us.
Mr. Chair, for those meetings that are scheduled during the traditional legislative breaks, they will be pre-scheduled as special meetings. I understand from planning staff, we should know about 3 months in advance whether there will be applications targeting those meetings, and if there are not, those meetings would be canceled. So it would be up to every week, but
Right.
may not be required on occasion.
I'm trying to think of a planning committee meeting in the 8 years I've been a city councillor in which there were no development applications, rezonings in front of us. And that's rhetorical, obviously. There are always zonings in front of planning committee every 2 weeks. So if there is, it is perfectly possible that planning committee members will have no weeks without a scheduled meeting through the course of the year. I guess my ask of staff, given that, we have a lot of, I'm looking around this table, there are a lot of counselors who have young kids who want to go on family vacations with those kids. They don't want to spend the several days leading up to the meeting reading planning reports. They don't necessarily want to be dealing with community associations on those last minute negotiations with the developer to try to get better development. They want to be able to spare the expense of summer camps. Like most parents, those 2 weeks of summer camp that you save when you get to go on break is a nice break on the family finances. For those counselors who want to go canoeing and actually be out of cell range for a week, this is going to be difficult. Are there ways in which we can try to be creative about those special meetings, making them special meetings with planning committee, agricultural and rural affairs committee, for example, ways to try to ensure quorum during particularly those that August meeting that traditionally gets canceled so that we can have a bit of a summer break? I mean, I'm one of the few remaining Gen Xers at the table, and we'll just power through, right? There's a few of us. Well, and we're going to be the ones who go to those meetings, right? Because those who have young kids are going to need that summer break. But I'm gobsmacked that we are going to have a scheduled meeting every week of the year as city councilors. What are there ways in which we can try to mitigate that?
Yes, Mr. Chair. The Office of the City Clerk is committed to working with planning services, the mayor, and the respective committee chairs to ensure we can achieve quorum for the meetings that are required and hold them in a manner that allows maximum flexibility for members of committee and council.
Yeah. It's remarkable when I take a look at the requirement to do this is being imposed on us by the province. We can't skip planning committee meetings and we can't skip council meetings. And when I take a look at the legislative break that the province takes during the summer, maybe someone could remind me how long a break that is. It's a long one. So we'll, for members of the committee, my commitment is to try to find ways to mitigate the impacts so that we can have a summer break, maybe a Christmas break, and maybe a March break. Just skip one meeting in each of those 3 months. All right, so colleagues, We have three reports in front of us, and a couple of those have got motions associated with them. Try to work through this fairly quickly. There is report 3.1, which is the Bill 109 implementation phase 2. There are motions addressing that report. The first of which is Councillor Johnson with respect to community participation during pre-consultation. Is that carried?
Carried.
Another motion was brought by Councillor Dudas with respect to direction to staff to review councillor participation in pre-consultation. Is that amendment carried? Also a motion with respect to 3.1 from Councillor Gower, development of a dispute resolution process for pre-consultation. Is that item carried? And also with respect to item 3.1, Bill 109, from Councillor DeRuse, Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee consideration amend recommendation 8D. Is that item carried? Is the report carried as amended? On item 3.2, this is the provincial legislation resource impact report. We have a single motion brought by Councillor Gower with respect to the legal services staff complement review in 2024 budget. Is that amendment carried? Is the report carried as amended? And is item 3.3 planning real estate, the delegated authority report, is item 3.3 carried? Thank you very much. Are there, we don't have any in-camera items. Are there any notices of motion for consideration as subsequent meeting? Seeing none. Are there any inquiries? Seeing none. There is no other business. Are we adjourned? Oh, we are adjourned. Thank you very much, members. Thank you so much to members of staff. I know Chair DeRuse and I want to pass on our thanks for a lot of work to try to make this remarkable piece of legislation workable for the city.